On June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, world leaders signed a treaty that was supposed to end all wars. The German delegation was forced to accept total blame for World War I, to pay crushing reparations, to surrender territory, to dismantle their military. As the signatures dried on the document, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch looked at the treaty and said something chilling. "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. He was wrong by just 65 days. Exactly 20 years and 65 days later, German tanks would roll into Poland, and the world would descend into a war that would kill more than 60 million people. But here's what your history teacher probably never told you. World War II didn't start in 1939, not even close. While textbooks mark September 1st, 1939 as the beginning, the truth is that World War II had already been raging for years. It just hadn't been called a world war yet. In 1937, Japanese forces were already slaughtering hundreds of thousands in Nanjing. In 1936, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy were testing their weapons and tactics in Spain, while Soviet forces clashed with Japanese armies in massive battles along the Mongolian border that most people have never even heard of. By the time Hitler invaded Poland, millions had already died in conflicts that were really just the opening acts of the same terrible drama. What if everything you learned about World War II's beginning was a Western-centric simplification of a far more complex global catastrophe? What if the war wasn't started by a single invasion, but was actually the inevitable explosion of tensions that had been building since the ink dried at Versailles? What if the 20-year period between the world wars wasn't peace at all, but rather a slow-burning fuse that everyone could see but no one could extinguish? This is the untold story of how World War I never really ended, how the so-called peace created the conditions for an even worse war, and how the world stumbled toward catastrophe with its eyes wide open, watching the disaster approach but unable or unwilling to stop it. This is the story of the wars before the war, the decisions that made mass slaughter inevitable, and the 20 years when humanity had a chance to choose a different path, but didn't. The story begins not in 1939, but on November 11th, 1918, when the guns finally fell silent after 4 years of industrialized slaughter that had killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. The soldiers who survived crawled out of trenches that had become mass graves, looked at the devastated landscape of Europe, and tried to understand what they had fought for and whether the unimaginable cost had been worth it. The answer that the victorious powers gave them at Versailles would plant the seeds for an even greater catastrophe. Picture the scene at Versailles in the spring of 1919. The Palace of Versailles, where French kings had once held court in opulent splendor, now hosted diplomats from 27 nations ostensibly gathered to create a lasting peace. But the conference was dominated by just 4 men: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. They called themselves the Big Four, and between them they would decide the fate of the world without consulting most of the people whose lives they were reshaping. Germany wasn't invited to negotiate. Neither were the other defeated Central Powers. They were simply presented with terms and told to sign or face renewed war. When the German delegation finally saw the treaty on May 7, 1919, they were stunned. The terms were far harsher than they had expected based on Wilson's 14 points, which had promised a peace without victory. Instead, they were handed a document that blamed Germany entirely for the war, the infamous War Guild Clause, demanded reparations so enormous that Germany could never realistically pay them, stripped Germany of 13% of its territory and all its overseas colonies, limited the German military to a tiny force forbidden from having tanks, aircraft, or submarines, and prohibited Germany from uniting with Austria. The German delegation protested that these terms would destroy their economy, humiliate their people, and make genuine peace impossible. Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, head of the German delegation, warned that the treaty would create lasting bitterness and make another war inevitable. He was ignored. The Allies had just lost a generation of young men to German guns and were in no mood for compromise.
France, in particular, wanted Germany punished and weakened so thoroughly that it could never threaten France again. But here's the terrible irony that becomes clear only in hindsight. The Treaty of Versailles was simultaneously too harsh and too lenient. It was harsh enough to create burning resentment in Germany, but not harsh enough to actually prevent Germany from eventually rebuilding its military power. A truly harsh peace would have permanently divided Germany into smaller states, occupied it indefinitely, and eliminated its capacity for industrial war-making. A truly lenient peace would have included Germany as an equal partner in building a new European order and would have addressed the legitimate grievances of all sides. Instead, Versailles did neither. It humiliated Germany without disarming it permanently, created grievances without providing justice, and built a peace on foundations of resentment rather than reconciliation. The French Marshal Foch understood this immediately. When he said the treaty was merely a 20-year armistice, he wasn't being prophetic, he was being analytical. He could see that the treaty had created conditions that made future conflict likely, while failing to create conditions that made lasting peace possible. And almost immediately, his fears began to be realized in ways that would echo through the next 2 decades. The immediate aftermath of World War I was not peace, but chaos. While diplomats argued in Versailles, revolutions and civil wars erupted across Europe. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution that had begun in 1917 exploded into a brutal civil war that would kill millions. The Western powers, terrified of communism spreading, intervened militarily, sending troops to support anti-Bolshevik forces. British, French, American, and Japanese forces fought on Russian soil in a conflict that most people today have never heard of, trying to strangle the Bolshevik state in its cradle. They failed, but the intervention created deep Soviet paranoia about Western intentions that would shape Stalin's decisions 2 decades later when Hitler rose to power.
But even as the League was being established, the economic foundations of the Versailles Peace were crumbling. The reparations demanded of Germany were astronomical, 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to about $442 billion in today's money. Germany couldn't pay, so France and Belgium occupied the industrial Ruhr region in 1923 to seize resources directly. The German government responded by encouraging workers to passively resist and by printing money to support them. The result was hyperinflation, so extreme that it destroyed the German middle class's savings, required workers to be paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they became worthless, and embedded in German consciousness a terror of inflation that shapes German economic policy to this day. The hyperinflation was eventually controlled through a new currency and an international agreement that restructured German reparations, but the damage was done. Millions of middle-class Germans who had worked hard, saved money, and played by the rules saw their life savings become worthless overnight. Many of them would remember who they blamed for this catastrophe: the democratic Weimar government and the Allied powers who had imposed the reparations. And when someone came along promising to restore German greatness and destroy the Versailles system, they would listen. That someone was already waiting in the wings. In November 1923, an obscure agitator named Adolf Hitler attempted a coup in Munich, hoping to seize power in Bavaria and march on Berlin. The beer hall putsch failed, and Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served less than 1 year. During his imprisonment, he wrote Mein Kampf, a book that laid out his worldview with brutal clarity. Germany had been stabbed in the back by traitors and Jews. The Versailles Treaty was a criminal humiliation that must be destroyed. Germany needed living space in the East that would be seized from Slavic peoples who would be enslaved or exterminated. And war was not only inevitable, but desirable as a test of racial strength. The book was published in 1925. Everything Hitler intended to do was right there in print for anyone to read. German politicians read it and assumed it was just rhetoric that would be moderated by the realities of governing. They were catastrophically wrong. Hitler meant every word, and when he gained power, he would systematically implement exactly the program he had described. But Hitler's rise was still years away. In the late 1920s, it seemed possible that the Versailles settlement might stabilize.
The Dawes Plan and later the Young Plan restructured German reparations on more manageable terms. Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in 1926. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 seemed to create a framework for peaceful coexistence in Europe, with Germany voluntarily accepting its western borders with France and Belgium. Leading statesmen won Nobel Peace Prizes for these achievements, congratulating themselves on creating a lasting peace. Then, in October 1929, the New York stock market crashed, triggering a global economic depression that would destroy the fragile stability of the 1920s and create the conditions for the rise of totalitarianism. The Great Depression hit Germany with particular force. American loans that had propped up the German economy were suddenly withdrawn. German exports collapsed as world trade shrank. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, roughly 30% of the workforce. Young men who had grown up in the chaos of post-war Germany, who had never known stability or prosperity, now face a future with no jobs, no hope, and a democratic government that seemed powerless to help them. The Depression was global, and everywhere it undermined democracy and fueled extremism. In Japan, the economic crisis empowered military officers who argued that Japan needed to seize resources and markets by force, leading to the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, a clear violation of the League of Nations covenant and international law, but one that the League proved unable to stop. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist dictatorship in 1922, and his aggressive nationalism and promises to restore Roman imperial glory appealed to Italians humiliated by their treatment at Versailles. In Spain, economic crisis contributed to political polarization that would explode into civil war. In the United States, the Depression brought Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, but it also strengthened isolationist sentiment, making Americans even less willing to involve themselves in foreign conflicts.
And in Germany, the Depression brought Adolf Hitler to power through constitutional means. In the 1930 elections, the Nazi Party won 18% of the vote, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. In July 1932, they won 37%, becoming the largest party. The conservative German establishment, desperate to contain both the Nazis and the communists, made a fateful calculation. They would bring Hitler into government as chancellor, surround him with traditional conservatives, and use him to destroy the left while controlling his excesses. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. Within months, Hitler had dismantled German democracy, established a totalitarian dictatorship, and begun implementing the program he had outlined in Mein Kampf. Now pay attention to this crucial point that most people miss. The rest of the world watched all of this happen and did essentially nothing. When Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations in 1933, there was no consequence. When he began openly rearming in violation of Versailles, there was no military response. When he reintroduced conscription in 1935, creating an army far larger than Versailles allowed, Britain actually rewarded this violation by signing a naval agreement with Germany. When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in March 1936, sending German troops into territory that Versailles had declared must remain demilitarized, France and Britain protested but took no action, even though Hitler later admitted that he would have withdrawn if France had shown any resistance. Why didn't the Western democracies stop Hitler when he was still relatively weak? The reasons were complex and reveal uncomfortable truths about the 1930s that textbooks often gloss over. First, there was widespread belief in Britain and America that the Versailles Treaty had been too harsh and that some revision in Germany's favor was reasonable. Second, many Western leaders saw Nazi Germany as a bulwark against Soviet communism, which they feared more than fascism. Third, the horrors of World War I had created such revulsion against war that populations and politicians alike would accept almost anything to avoid another conflict. Fourth, the Depression had weakened Western economies and militaries, making military action seem unaffordable. And fifth, there was a racist assumption among Western leaders that European fascism was fundamentally different from Japanese militarism and that it could be reasoned with and accommodated.
But while the Western democracies debated and temporized, the world was already at war. It just wasn't being called that yet. In 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, establishing a puppet state called Manchukuo and beginning a pattern of aggressive expansion in China. The League of Nations sent a commission that produced a report condemning Japan's actions. Japan responded by withdrawing from the League and continuing its occupation. No one did anything to stop them. The lesson was clear. International law and collective security were meaningless if no one was willing to enforce them. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of only two independent nations in Africa, the other being Liberia. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie made an impassioned plea to the League of Nations, warning that Ethiopia's fate today would be every small nation's fate tomorrow. The League imposed economic sanctions on Italy, but they were half-hearted and deliberately excluded the one commodity, oil, that might have actually forced Italy to stop. Britain and France were more concerned with keeping Italy as a potential ally against Germany than with defending Ethiopia. By 1936, Italy had conquered Ethiopia using poison gas and aerial bombing against poorly equipped Ethiopian forces. Haile Selassie went into exile, and Mussolini declared that a new Roman Empire had been born. But one of the most significant conflicts that revealed how close the world already was to general war was the Spanish Civil War, which erupted in July 1936 when right-wing military officers led by General Franco launched a coup against Spain's democratically elected Republican government. The coup didn't succeed immediately, and Spain descended into a brutal civil war that became a proxy conflict for the larger ideological struggles tearing apart the world. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy intervened on Franco's side, sending troops, aircraft, and weapons. The Soviet Union intervened on the Republican side, though less extensively. Germany used Spain as a testing ground for its rebuilt military, trying out new weapons and tactics that would later be used in World War II. The Luftwaffe's Condor Legion bombed Spanish cities, most infamously Guernica in April 1937, an attack immortalized in Picasso's painting. German tank crews gained combat experience. German officers refined the tactics of blitzkrieg warfare. The Spanish Civil War revealed in miniature what the coming global war would look like. Ideological conflict between fascism, democracy, and communism, aerial bombardment of civilian populations, tanks and aircraft dominating the battlefield, and foreign intervention turning a local conflict into an international crisis. And it revealed once again that the democracies would not act. Britain and France adopted a policy of non-intervention, refusing to sell arms to the Spanish Republic, even as Germany and Italy poured support to Franco. This meant that a democratically elected government was left defenseless, while dictatorships armed its enemies.
Tens of thousands of foreign volunteers did join the international brigades to fight for the Spanish Republic, motivated by anti-fascism and the belief that Spain was the place to stop the fascist tide. Writers like George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway went to Spain and wrote about what they saw. But without government support, the Republic was doomed. By 1939, Franco had won, establishing a fascist dictatorship that would last until his death in 1975. The lesson Hitler and Mussolini drew from Spain was that the democracies were weak and divided, that they would not fight to stop fascist expansion, and that aggressive action would be rewarded rather than punished. But here's what most people don't know. While all of this was happening in Europe and the Mediterranean, massive battles were already being fought in Asia that would kill hundreds of thousands and that were actually part of the same global conflict. In July 1937, a clash between Japanese and Chinese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing escalated into full-scale war. Japan invaded China proper, launching a campaign of conquest and brutality that would eventually kill somewhere between 15 and 20 million Chinese people, more than the total number of people who died in all of World War I. The early phase of the Japanese invasion of China included the Rape of Nanjing in December 1937, when Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital and spent 6 weeks engaged in mass murder, rape, and looting on a staggering scale.
Between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were killed. Women and girls from ages 8 to 80 were raped, often multiple times and often murdered afterward. The Japanese held killing contests, seeing who could behead the most Chinese. International observers documented these atrocities, and they were reported in Western newspapers, but the world did nothing. China was at war, but it was at war alone. The Chinese resistance, divided between the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces led by Mao Zedong, nevertheless fought on. They employed scorched earth tactics, retreating into the interior and destroying anything that might be useful to the Japanese. Chiang ordered the destruction of dikes on the Yellow River in 1938, flooding thousands of square miles and killing hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians, but temporarily halting the Japanese advance. The nationalists moved their capital to Chongqing in China's interior, where they continued to resist, despite being cut off from the coast, and despite Japanese aerial bombardment that would eventually kill thousands. If you asked when World War II began for the Chinese people, they would tell you 1937, or even 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria. By the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, China had already been fighting for years. Millions had already died, and the conflict in Asia was already a war of annihilation. But this war was largely ignored in the West, seen as an Asian affair that didn't involve European interests. This blindness to the Asian dimension of the conflict would prove disastrous when Japan eventually attacked Western colonies and the United States, creating a truly global war. Meanwhile, on the border between Japanese-controlled Manchuria and the Soviet Far East, battles were being fought in 1938 and 1939 that most people have never heard of, but that involved hundreds of thousands of troops and that shaped the course of World War II. Japanese and Soviet forces clashed at Lake Khasan in 1938 and then at Khalkhin Gol in Mongolia in 1939, in battles that involved tanks, aircraft, and artillery on a massive scale. At Khalkhin Gol, Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov defeated the Japanese in a decisive battle that killed tens of thousands and convinced Japan to sign a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union and look south toward European colonies in Southeast Asia rather than north towards Soviet territory. This decision, that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union, was absolutely crucial to the outcome of World War II. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Soviets were able to transfer troops from their Far Eastern armies to defend Moscow because they knew Japan would not attack from the east. If Japan had attacked Siberia in 1941 instead of Pearl Harbor, the Soviet Union would have faced a two-front war that it might not have survived. The battles at Khalkhin Gol, which textbooks rarely mention, helped determine whether the Soviets would be able to defeat Germany.
While these wars raged in China and on the Soviet-Japanese border, Europe was careening toward catastrophe through a series of crises that revealed the complete failure of the Versailles settlement and the League of Nations. In March 1938, Hitler sent German troops into Austria and declared its annexation to Germany in what was called the Anschluss. This violated the Treaty of Versailles explicitly, but Britain and France did nothing. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation, and suddenly Germany was much larger and more powerful. 6 months later came the Munich crisis. Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia surrender the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. Czechoslovakia had defensive alliances with France and the Soviet Union and had formidable border fortifications. It was prepared to fight. But Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, pressured Czechoslovakia to surrender. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and met with Hitler, Mussolini, and French Premier Édouard Daladier. The Czechs weren't invited to the conference that would decide their fate. Chamberlain returned to Britain claiming he had achieved peace for our time and waving a piece of paper with Hitler's signature, promising no further territorial demands. The crowds cheered. Many people genuinely believed that war had been averted. But Winston Churchill, then a backbench member of Parliament, warned that Britain had chosen dishonor and would get war anyway. He was right.
In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking the promise he had made at Munich and revealing that appeasement had been a complete failure. The Sudetenland's fortifications were now in German hands, and Czechoslovakia's significant armaments industry was now serving the German war machine. Finally, Britain and France realized that Hitler could not be appeased, that his ambitions were unlimited, and that war was inevitable. They began rearming seriously and gave guarantees to Poland, Hitler's obvious next target, promising to declare war if Germany invaded. But it was far too late. The years when Germany had been weak and could have been stopped had been wasted in appeasement and wishful thinking. Now Germany was powerful, having annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, having built a formidable military in violation of Versailles, and having gained combat experience in Spain. And then came the most shocking development of the entire interwar period, a development so unexpected that it stunned the world and made the outbreak of general war inevitable. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies who had been portrayed as the mortal foes of the age, signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who signed it, contained secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. Poland would be partitioned, the Baltic states would go to the Soviet Union, both dictatorships would gain territory and security, while the democracies were left isolated and helpless. Stalin's motivations for this shocking reversal were complex. He had offered to ally with Britain and France against Hitler, but the negotiations had foundered on Western reluctance to allow Soviet troops on Polish soil and on mutual distrust. Stalin concluded that the West wanted Germany and the Soviet Union to exhaust each other in war, while the democracies stood aside. So he decided to make his own deal with Hitler, buying time to prepare for the war he knew was still coming while gaining territory and avoiding immediate conflict. It was ruthlessly cynical and brutally effective. For Hitler, the pact removed the threat of a two-front war. As long as the Soviet Union was neutral, Germany could attack Poland without fearing Soviet intervention, and if Britain and France did declare war, Germany could focus all its forces on the West. Everything was now in place for the war that had been building for 20 years, that had been made virtually inevitable by the vindictive peace of Versailles and the subsequent failures of will by the democracies. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had officially begun. But as we've seen, this wasn't really the beginning. It was just the moment when the conflicts that had been burning in Spain, China, Ethiopia, and elsewhere merged into a general conflagration that would consume the entire world.
The lesson of the interwar period is not a simple one about appeasement being wrong and military strength being right, though there's truth to that. The deeper lesson is about how a failed peace, built on humiliation and resentment rather than justice and reconciliation, creates the conditions for renewed conflict. It's about how economic catastrophe can destroy democracy and empower extremism. It's about how incremental decisions that seem reasonable at the time can lead to catastrophe when no one is willing to draw a firm line. It's about how wars in distant places can seem irrelevant until they merge into a global catastrophe that threatens everyone. The 20 years between the world wars weren't peacetime. They were a period of instability, violence, and gathering storm clouds that everyone could see but that no one seemed able to dispel. By the time the storm finally broke in its full fury in September 1939, millions had already died in conflicts that were really part of the same war, and the world was about to descend into a darkness that would make the trenches of World War I seem almost quaint by comparison. The war that was about to begin would kill between 70 and 85 million people. It would see entire cities incinerated from the air, death camps industrializing genocide, battles involving millions of soldiers across continents, and technologies of destruction culminating in atomic weapons that could end human civilization. And all of it, all of the horror that was coming, could be traced back to the failures of 1919, when the victors of World War I had chosen vengeance over wisdom and had created not peace, but simply a pause before an even worse catastrophe. Marshal Foch had been right. Versailles was not peace. It was an armistice for 20 years, and now the armistice was over. As German tanks rolled into Poland and Britain and France declared war, the world's attention focused on Europe. That's where the textbooks focus too, on the Blitzkrieg, on the fall of France, on the Battle of Britain, on the Eastern Front, on D-Day and the liberation of Europe. And those events were crucial. But what almost every World War II history taught in Western schools misses is that Europe was never the only battlefield, and for many millions of people, it wasn't even the most important one. While France fell in 1940, China continued its desperate resistance that had already cost millions of lives. While Britain stood alone against the Luftwaffe, Indian soldiers were fighting in North Africa, Burma, and Italy. While Americans landed at Normandy, some of the war's most brutal jungle fighting was occurring in Burma and New Guinea. While the Red Army advanced on Berlin, Australian and American forces were still island hopping across the Pacific. This was not just a European war that happened to have a Pacific sideshow. It was a truly global war involving every inhabited continent, fought by soldiers from dozens of nations that killed more people in Asia than in Europe, and that shaped the post-war world just as profoundly in the colonized world as in Europe and America. In our next chapter, we will leave the familiar narrative of the European War and explore the forgotten fronts, the theaters of World War II that textbooks mention briefly, if at all, but that were just as significant as the battles we all know. We will meet the Chinese soldiers who fought Japan for 8 years before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. We will march with Indian troops through the Burmese jungle. We will see battles in Ethiopia and East Africa that most people don't know happened. We will discover that World War II was far larger, far more complex, and far more global than the simplified narrative of Allied victory over the Axis suggests. The war you think you know was only part of the story. The forgotten fronts await.
Here's a test. When you think of World War II battles, what comes to mind? Probably D-Day, right? Maybe Stalingrad, the Battle of Britain, the Battle of the Bulge. Now answer this. Have you ever heard of the Battle of Changsha? What about the Burma campaign, the Battle of Wuhan, the East African campaign? If you answered no, you're not alone. Most people in the West haven't. Yet the Battle of Wuhan alone involved over 1 million troops. The Burma campaign killed hundreds of thousands, and the single deadliest battle of the entire war, measured by combined military and civilian casualties, wasn't Stalingrad or even the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. It was the Battle of Chongqing, where Japanese bombers killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in what became history's longest aerial bombardment, and most people have never even heard of it. Here's what's truly shocking. When we say World War II killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, most of those deaths didn't happen in Europe. They happened in China, where somewhere between 15 and 20 million people died, more than twice the number of Soviets killed, and roughly 3 times the number of all Germans who died in the war. They happened in Southeast Asia, where millions of civilians starved to death under Japanese occupation. They happened across Africa and the Middle East and the Pacific in conflicts that shaped the post-war world just as profoundly as anything that happened in Berlin or Paris. But here's the question that should make you angry. Why don't we know these stories? Why did your history teacher spend weeks on D-Day but probably never mentioned that Chinese forces were fighting a desperate battle at Changsha that involved more troops than landed at Normandy? Why do we know every detail about the Battle of Britain, but nothing about the fact that the British Raj forced 3 million Indians to starve to death in Bengal while exporting food to support the war effort? Why are there dozens of Hollywood movies about the war in Europe, but almost none about the China, Burma, India theater, where soldiers fought and died in conditions that made the European theater look comfortable? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about whose stories we tell and whose we forget, about whose sacrifices we honor and whose we ignore, about how the good war narrative that dominates Western memory of World War II obscures the experiences of the majority of people who actually lived through and died in the conflict.
This is the story of the forgotten fronts, of the wars that were just as brutal, just as significant, and just as worthy of remembrance as the battles that fill our textbooks, but that have been written out of the popular narrative of World War II. Let's begin where the war actually started, not in Poland in 1939, but in China in 1937. And let's be clear about something that Western education systematically obscures. For the Chinese people, World War II wasn't a war that started in 1939 and ended in 1945. It was a war that began in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria, that escalated into full-scale invasion in 1937, and that didn't end until 1945. That's 14 years of warfare. 8 years of total war before Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the conflict that Americans remember as the beginning of the real war. On July 7, 1937, a clash between Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing spiraled into full-scale war. Within weeks, Japanese forces were advancing on Shanghai, China's largest city and its commercial heart. What followed was the Battle of Shanghai, a 3-month urban battle that involved nearly 1 million troops on both sides and that killed more people than all the European battles of 1939 through 1940 combined. Chinese troops, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with desperate courage, holding out from August until November before the city finally fell. When Shanghai fell, the Chinese nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek retreated to their capital at Nanjing, hoping to defend it. But the Japanese advance was relentless, and by December 13, 1937, Japanese forces had captured Nanjing. What happened next was so horrific that it shocked the world, or at least it would have if the world had been paying attention. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers engaged in an orgy of violence that killed between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Women and girls from ages 6 to 80 were raped. Some estimates suggest 20,000 to 80,000 rapes occurred. Japanese soldiers held killing contests, competing to see who could behead the most Chinese. Bodies were left in the streets or dumped in the Yangtze River. The few Western civilians who remained in Nanjing, mostly missionaries and businessmen, tried to create a safety zone to protect Chinese civilians, documenting what they witnessed in diaries and photographs that would later become crucial evidence of Japanese atrocities.
Now, here's what you need to understand. This wasn't a secret. Western newspapers reported on the rape of Nanjing. Photographs were published. The Reverend John McGee filmed footage of the atrocities on his 16mm camera. The world knew what Japan was doing in China, and the world did essentially nothing. No sanctions were imposed that would have actually stopped Japan. No military action was taken. The League of Nations issued condemnations that Japan ignored. Life magazine published photos of dead Chinese civilians in 1937, but American companies continued selling scrap metal and oil to Japan, resources that would be used to build the weapons and fuel the aircraft that would eventually attack Pearl Harbor. Why? Because in the calculus of Western powers in the 1930s, what happened to Chinese people simply didn't matter as much as what happened to Europeans. There was racism, certainly, the casual assumption that Asian lives were somehow less valuable than white lives, but there was also strategic calculation. Britain and France were focused on the threat from Germany and had extensive colonial holdings in Asia that they were trying to protect through accommodation with Japan. The United States was deeply isolationist and had no desire to involve itself in Asian conflicts. The Soviet Union was the only major power that provided significant military aid to China, not out of altruism, but because Japanese aggression in China meant Japan was less likely to attack Soviet territory. So China fought on alone. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek retreated into the interior, moving the capital to Chongqing in Sichuan province, deep in China's southwestern mountains. The Japanese controlled the coast and the major cities, but they couldn't control the vast interior of China, where Chiang's forces, along with communist guerrillas led by Mao Zedong, continued to resist. The Chinese employed scorched earth tactics, destroying anything that might be useful to the Japanese, trading space for time, making the Japanese pay in blood for every mile they advanced. In 1938, Chiang Kai-shek made one of the most controversial decisions of the war. He ordered the destruction of dikes on the Yellow River, unleashing massive floods that killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians but temporarily halted the Japanese advance. It was a desperate measure that revealed the impossible choices facing Chinese leaders: watch the Japanese advance unopposed, or sacrifice Chinese civilians to slow them down. Chiang chose to sacrifice his own people, a decision that has been debated ever since. Meanwhile, the Japanese established puppet governments in occupied China, most notably the regime of Wang Jingwei in Nanjing, a former nationalist who defected to collaborate with Japan. But these puppet regimes controlled very little beyond the cities and the railways. In the countryside, Chinese guerrillas, both nationalist and communist, waged a constant war of ambushes, sabotage, and assassination that tied down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops who might otherwise have been used elsewhere. From 1938 to 1945, the Japanese conducted repeated campaigns to try to destroy Chinese resistance, but they never succeeded. The Battle of Changsha was fought 4 times between 1939 and 1942, with Chinese forces successfully defending the city 3 times before finally losing it in the 4th battle, only to recapture it again in 1945. These battles involved hundreds of thousands of troops and caused massive casualties, but they're virtually unknown in the West. The deadliest aspect of the war in China wasn't even the battles. It was the systematic brutality with which Japan treated Chinese civilians and the catastrophic famines that Japanese occupation policies created. The 3 alls policy, kill all, burn all, loot all, was implemented in northern China, where Japanese forces destroyed entire villages suspected of supporting guerrillas. Biological warfare experiments were conducted at Unit 731 in Manchuria, where Japanese doctors infected Chinese prisoners with plague, anthrax, and other diseases to test their effects, killing thousands in experiments that rival the Nazi death camps for sheer inhumanity. Yet while Nazi war crimes are extensively taught and documented, most people have never heard of Unit 731. Japanese occupation created famines that killed millions. The Henan famine of 1942-43 killed somewhere between 1 and 3 million people in a disaster that was caused by a combination of drought, locusts, and Japanese and Chinese nationalist policies that confiscated grain from peasants. The famine in Vietnam in 1944-45, caused by Japanese occupation authorities forcing farmers to grow jute for military use instead of rice for food, killed between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese.
When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, China finally had a powerful ally. American aid began flowing through the Burma Road, and after that route was cut, via aircraft flying the Hump, the dangerous route over the Himalayas that killed hundreds of American and Chinese pilots. American General Joseph Stilwell was assigned to command Chinese forces, leading to a famously contentious relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. The American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, commanded by Claire Chennault, fought Japanese aircraft over China. But even with American support, the Chinese theater remained a secondary priority for the United States, which focused its resources on Europe first and the Pacific island hopping campaign second. Chinese forces continued to tie down over 1 million Japanese troops throughout the war, preventing those forces from being used against the Americans in the Pacific or against the Soviets, who didn't enter the war against Japan until August 1945. Without Chinese resistance, the Pacific War would have been far longer and bloodier for the United States. Yet when the war ended and the victory celebrations began, China's contribution was largely forgotten in the West. The photographs we remember from VJ Day are of Americans kissing in Times Square, not of Chinese civilians celebrating after 8 years of brutal occupation. The casualty figures we cite tend to emphasize American and European deaths, while treating Chinese deaths as footnotes. The narrative of World War II became a story about the United States and Britain defeating Germany and Japan, with the Chinese resistance reduced to a minor subplot. This erasure has had lasting consequences.
The fact that most Americans don't know that China was fighting Japan for years before Pearl Harbor contributes to a narrative in which the United States saved China from Japan, rather than joining a war that China had been fighting desperately for years. It obscures the fact that China suffered more casualties than any nation except the Soviet Union, and that Chinese resistance was crucial to the ultimate defeat of Japan. Now let's travel west to another forgotten front, the China-Burma-India theater, a region that saw some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war under conditions that made European battlefields seem comfortable. The Burma campaign was fought from 1942 to 1945 across jungle terrain, in monsoon conditions, through swamps and mountains, where disease killed more soldiers than combat and where the infrastructure was so primitive that everything had to be supplied by air or carried on soldiers' backs. Burma mattered because it was the route through which supplies could reach China after Japan had cut the coastal ports. The Burma Road, built by hundreds of thousands of Chinese laborers, snaked through mountains from Burma into Yunnan province, providing a lifeline for Chinese resistance. When Japan invaded Burma in early 1942, one of their strategic objectives was to cut this supply line and isolate China completely. The British forces defending Burma were a polyglot collection of British, Indian, Burmese, and Chinese troops under overall British command. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and forced into a fighting retreat that became one of the longest retreats in British military history, over 1,000 miles from southern Burma to the Indian border. Tens of thousands of refugees, both military and civilian, fled alongside the retreating army, dying from disease, starvation, and Japanese attacks. Among the forces fighting in Burma were hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers, fighting for the British Empire that colonized their homeland. This is where the narrative of World War II as the Good War becomes deeply complicated. Indian soldiers fought with courage and skill in Burma, North Africa, Italy, and elsewhere. Over 2 million Indians served in the war, the largest volunteer army in history. But they were fighting for an empire that denied them basic rights, that imprisoned their independence leaders, and that would, during the war itself, allow 3 million Indians to starve to death in the Bengal famine. Let's pause on that because it's something that almost never appears in Western accounts of World War II. While Indian soldiers were dying in Burma fighting for the British Empire, British policies were creating a famine in Bengal that killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. The famine was caused by a complex combination of factors: natural disaster, wartime disruption, panic buying, but it was made catastrophic by British policies that prioritized food for the military and for stockpiling in other parts of the empire over feeding starving Bengalis. Winston Churchill, celebrated in the West as a hero of the war, responded to the famine with indifference bordering on contempt. When officials pleaded for food relief to be sent to Bengal, Churchill reportedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the famine was so bad. He wrote that the famine was Indians' own fault for breeding like rabbits. Ships that could have carried food to Bengal were diverted to build stockpiles in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. Rice continued to be exported for India even as millions starved. This is the same Winston Churchill who is quoted in every Western textbook about standing firm against tyranny, about fighting on the beaches, about Britain's finest hour. And he was indeed crucial to defeating Nazi Germany, but he was also a committed imperialist who held deeply racist views about non-white peoples and who bears significant responsibility for one of the largest famines of the 20th century. Both things are true, and ignoring the second because it complicates the narrative about the first is a disservice to the millions who died. The Burma campaign eventually turned around when General William Slim organized British and Commonwealth forces, including large numbers of Indians, Africans, and Gurkhas, into the 14th Army, and, with American support from Merrill's Marauders and Chinese forces, began pushing the Japanese back. The fighting was brutal beyond description. Battles fought in monsoon rains, in jungles where visibility was measured in yards, against an enemy that fought to the death and that had established formidable defensive positions.
The Battle of Imphal and Kohima in 1944 saw Japanese forces attempt to invade India itself, besieging these towns on the Indian border in battles that involved tens of thousands of troops fighting in conditions of unimaginable difficulty. The Japanese offensive failed, partly due to British and Indian resistance, and partly due to their own logistical collapse. Japanese soldiers starved to death in the jungle, cut off from supplies, dying of disease and malnutrition in greater numbers than died in combat. By 1945, British forces had driven the Japanese out of Burma, but the victory came at enormous cost. Tens of thousands of British, Indian, African, and Chinese troops died, along with unknown numbers of Burmese civilians caught in the fighting. Disease, malaria, dysentery, typhus, killed more soldiers than combat did. The psychological toll was immense, with soldiers fighting for months in jungle conditions where they rarely saw more than a few yards ahead, where the enemy was invisible until they attacked, where death came from disease as often from bullets. And here's what makes this even more poignant. Many of the Indian and African soldiers fighting in Burma were fighting for empires that colonized their homelands, for the right of Europeans to rule over them. After the war, these veterans would return home expecting some recognition, some reward for their service. Instead, they would face continued colonial rule, and would often be treated as threats by colonial authorities who feared that veterans trained in combat might join independence movements. Let's shift our view to another forgotten front, East Africa, where battles were fought in 1940 to 1941 that most people have never heard of. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, it controlled Libya, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland, creating an enormous empire in East Africa that threatened British colonies in Kenya, Sudan, and British Somaliland. Italian forces invaded British Somaliland in August 1940 and conquered it, forcing British withdrawal. It was one of the few clear Axis victories of 1940, but it's rarely mentioned in histories that focus on the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. The British counterattacked in early 1941, invading Italian East Africa from multiple directions with forces that included British, Indian, South African, East African, and West African troops, along with Ethiopian resistance fighters loyal to Emperor Haile Selassie, who had been living in exile since Italy conquered Ethiopia in 1936. The East African Campaign of 1941 saw British and Commonwealth forces defeat Italian forces and liberate Ethiopia in a campaign that involved fighting across some of the most difficult terrain in the world: mountains, deserts, and tropical regions where disease was rampant. The campaign was successful, with Italian East Africa falling to British control by late 1941 and Haile Selassie returning to his throne. But the campaign is almost completely forgotten in popular memory of the war, overshadowed by the more famous North African campaign against Rommel in Libya and Egypt.
The forces that fought in East Africa included tens of thousands of African soldiers from British colonies: Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, Nigeria, Gold Coast, and others. These men fought for the British Empire with the expectation that their service might lead to better treatment and perhaps eventual independence for their colonies. After the war, they would be disappointed to find that European colonial powers intended to maintain their empires despite the irony of having just fought a war supposedly about defending freedom. Speaking of the North African campaign, while it does appear in textbooks, what's often missing is the full story of who actually did the fighting. When we think of the Desert War, we tend to picture British forces under Montgomery fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps. But the reality is that the forces fighting in North Africa were extraordinarily diverse. British forces included large numbers of Indians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, and Africans. The Free French forces fighting alongside the British included troops from French colonies in Africa. Even the British units often had significant numbers of non-British soldiers. The Battle of El Alamein in 1942, celebrated as Montgomery's great victory, was fought by this diverse coalition. Indian troops formed a significant portion of the forces, as did Australians and New Zealanders. Yet the battle is remembered in Britain as a British victory, with the contribution of colonial and Dominion troops downplayed or forgotten.
This pattern repeats throughout the war. Diverse forces fight, but the victory is credited primarily to European and American units. Let's travel even further from the familiar narrative, to a front that seems almost fantastical, the Arctic. Most people don't know that World War II was fought in the Arctic, but it was. The Arctic convoys that brought American and British supplies to Soviet ports were among the most dangerous missions of the war, with ships battling German submarines and aircraft, while also facing ice, storms, and temperatures that could kill a man in minutes. The most famous disaster of the Arctic convoys was Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942, which was ordered to scatter when British intelligence suggested that the German battleship Tirpitz was about to attack. The convoy dispersed, leaving individual ships vulnerable to German submarines and aircraft. Of the 35 merchant ships in the convoy, 24 were sunk, along with most of their cargoes of tanks, aircraft, and supplies desperately needed by the Soviets. Hundreds of sailors died in the freezing Arctic waters. But the convoys continued because the supplies they carried were crucial to Soviet survival. Between 1941 and 1945, the Arctic convoys delivered over 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union, including thousands of tanks, aircraft, trucks, and other equipment. Soviet victory on the Eastern Front, which did more than anything else to defeat Nazi Germany, was enabled in part by these supplies carried through Arctic waters at enormous cost. Now, let's look at Latin America, a region that most people don't even know was involved in World War II. But Brazil sent an expeditionary force of 25,000 troops to fight in Italy, the only South American nation to send combat forces to Europe. Brazilian troops fought in the Italian campaign in 1944-45, suffering hundreds of casualties and playing a role in the Allied victory. Yet, how many people know that Brazilians fought in Italy? Mexico also declared war on the Axis and sent an air squadron, Escuadrón 201, to fight in the Philippines in 1945. Thousands of Latin Americans joined the U.S. military and fought in various theaters. Latin American nations provided crucial resources: Chilean copper, Brazilian rubber, Argentine food, Mexican oil, that supported the Allied war effort. U-boats operated in the Caribbean and off the South American coast, sinking hundreds of ships and killing thousands of merchant sailors. The war touched Latin America in ways that are rarely acknowledged in histories written from U.S. or European perspectives. And here's a dimension of the war that almost never gets mentioned: the role of colonial resources in enabling the Allies to fight. The British Empire mobilized resources from India, Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. Rubber from Malaya, tin from the Dutch East Indies, oil from the Middle East, food from Africa and the Caribbean. These resources were extracted from colonized peoples, often with little or no compensation, to support a war that was supposedly being fought for freedom. The contradiction was stark. The Allies were fighting against Nazi Germany's attempt to create a racial empire in Europe while maintaining their own racial empires in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. When Roosevelt and Churchill met and issued the Atlantic Charter in August 1941, proclaiming the right of all peoples to self-determination, Churchill immediately clarified that this didn't apply to the British Empire. The war was being fought for European freedom, not for the freedom of colonized peoples who were expected to continue providing resources and troops for their colonial masters. This contradiction was not lost on colonized peoples. Indian independence leaders asked why they should fight for British freedom when Britain denied them freedom. African intellectuals noted the irony of fighting fascism in Europe while living under colonial racism at home. The war simultaneously strengthened and weakened colonial empires. Strengthened because colonial resources were crucial to Allied victory, weakened because the contradiction between fighting for freedom while maintaining empires became impossible to ignore. The Japanese, despite their own brutality, exploited this contradiction effectively, presenting themselves as liberators, freeing Asians from European colonialism. In some places, Burma, Indonesia, the Philippines, this message resonated, at least initially, before Japanese occupation revealed itself to be at least as brutal as European colonialism.
The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere that Japan proclaimed was a sham, a cover for Japanese domination that extracted resources and labor just as European empires had. But the fact that Japanese propaganda was hypocritical didn't make the underlying contradiction any less real. Colonized peoples fighting for the Allies were fighting for the freedom of their colonizers while remaining unfree themselves. After the war, this contradiction would help fuel independence movements across Asia and Africa, as veterans returned home unwilling to accept continued colonial rule after fighting supposedly for freedom.
Let's return to the Pacific, but to aspects of that war that are less well known. Everyone knows about Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But what about the Burma Railway, the death railway that the Japanese built using Allied prisoners of war and Asian laborers? Over 100,000 people died building that railway through jungle and mountains, 12,000 Allied POWs, and somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 Asian laborers, mostly Burmese, Malayan, and Tamil. The conditions were horrific beyond description. Men worked 18-hour days with minimal food, brutal beatings for any perceived shirking, no medical care, in tropical heat and monsoon rain. Cholera, dysentery, malaria, and other diseases killed thousands. Men were beaten to death for being too sick to work. The Japanese guards showed no mercy, working prisoners literally to death to complete the railway on schedule. This was the reality of Japanese occupation: systematic brutality, forced labor, mass death. In Southeast Asia, Japanese occupation killed millions through direct violence, forced labor, and the famines that occupation policies created. The Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, saw between 2 and 4 million deaths under Japanese occupation. Vietnam saw 1 to 2 million die in the famine of 1944-45. Malaya saw tens of thousands killed in the Suk Ching massacre and subsequent occupation. What about the comfort women, the sexual slavery system that the Japanese military established, forcing hundreds of thousands of women, mostly Korean but also Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, and others, into sexual servitude for Japanese soldiers? This is a crime that wasn't widely acknowledged until decades after the war, partly because the victims were ashamed to speak about what had been done to them, partly because it involved sexual violence that societies were uncomfortable discussing, and partly because the United States, which occupied Japan after the war, chose to downplay Japanese war crimes to make Japan a useful Cold War ally. These women were often kidnapped, sometimes deceived by offers of factory work, forced into comfort stations where they were raped by dozens of men daily, suffering violence and disease, many dying or being killed when they were no longer useful. Survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Japan's failure to fully acknowledge and compensate for this crime remains a source of tension in Asia today. Or consider the forced labor that Japan imposed across its empire. Millions of people from Korea, China, and elsewhere forced to work in mines, factories, and on construction projects under brutal conditions. Many died from the work, from malnutrition, from disease, from violence. These weren't just crimes against POWs, they were crimes against civilians on a massive scale. The scale of atrocity in the Asian theater of World War II rivals anything that happened in Europe, but it's far less known in the West. The rape of Nanjing killed as many people as died in some of the Nazi extermination camps. Unit 731's biological warfare experiments were as cruel as anything Mengele did at Auschwitz. The Burma Railway killed a higher percentage of the workers forced to build it than died in many Nazi concentration camps. The comfort women system was a form of sexual slavery on a scale almost unprecedented in modern history. Why is this less known? Partly because the victor's justice applied at the end of the war was selective. Nazi crimes were extensively documented and prosecuted at Nuremberg, but Japanese crimes were often downplayed or ignored because the United States wanted Japan as an ally against communism in Asia.
partly because Asian lives have historically been valued less than European lives in Western consciousness, partly because the narrative of World War II became a story about the fight against Nazi evil, with Japanese crimes treated as secondary, and partly because the Cold War that followed the war created incentives to forget Japanese crimes while emphasizing Soviet participation in Japanese war crimes prosecution.
The Tokyo war crimes trials did prosecute some Japanese leaders, and 7 were executed, including former Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. But the trials were far less thorough than Nuremberg. Many war criminals escaped prosecution, and Emperor Hirohito, who bore ultimate responsibility for Japanese aggression, was never charged because the United States decided that keeping the emperor was necessary for controlling Japan during the occupation. The result is that while Nazi crimes are extensively taught, documented, and remembered, which they should be, Japanese crimes receive far less attention in Western education. Students learn about the Holocaust, but not about the rape of Nanjing. They learn about Nazi forced labor camps, but not about the Burma Railway or comfort women. They learn that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, but not that somewhere between 15 and 20 million Chinese died under Japanese occupation. This selective memory matters because it shapes how we understand the war. The narrative of World War II as the good war, where democracy triumphed over fascism, is complicated when we acknowledge that many of the good guys were fighting to maintain colonial empires, that some of the worst atrocities happened in theaters that Western education ignores, that Allied victory came at a cost paid largely by people who remained unfree after the war ended. Understanding these forgotten fronts doesn't diminish the significance of the European theater or the importance of defeating Nazi Germany. D-Day was crucial. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point. The liberation of the concentration camps revealed evil that must never be forgotten. But these events were part of a much larger global conflict that involved more people, covered more territory, and killed more civilians in Asia than in Europe. The Chinese soldier who fought Japan for 8 years before Pearl Harbor was just as important to Allied victory as the American GI who landed at Normandy. The Indian troops who fought in Burma, North Africa, and Italy while their own people starved in Bengal deserve to be remembered alongside British and American forces. The millions of Asians who died under Japanese occupation suffered just as terribly as Europeans under Nazi rule. The African and Latin American contributions to the war effort were real and significant, even if they've been written out of the popular narrative. The war was global, fought on every inhabited continent, involving people of every race and nationality. It killed more people in Asia than in Europe. It was won through contributions from dozens of nations, not just the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And it ended not with clear moral triumph, but with complicated outcomes that included continued colonialism, the beginning of the Cold War, and moral compromises that haunt us still. The forgotten fronts matter because they tell us that history is always more complex than the simple stories we learn, that the experiences of the majority of the world's people are often invisible in narratives written by and for Western audiences, and that understanding what really happened requires listening to voices that have been marginalized or silenced. The global war we've explored, fought across China, Burma, East Africa, the Arctic, and elsewhere, was the war that soldiers and civilians experienced directly. But there was another war happening simultaneously, a shadow war fought by spies, resistance fighters, saboteurs, and codebreakers. This was the war that most civilians never saw, but that shaped outcomes just as profoundly as the massive battles we've discussed. While armies clashed on battlefields from Stalingrad to Burma, a different kind of warfare was being waged in the shadows. In occupied Europe and Asia, resistance movements fought guerrilla campaigns against Axis forces, conducting sabotage, gathering intelligence, and keeping hope alive for liberation. In secret facilities, codebreakers worked to crack enemy communications, achieving breakthroughs that would shorten the war by years.
Special Operations Forces conducted raids deep behind enemy lines, disrupting enemy operations and tying down forces that might have been used elsewhere. This was the war of intelligence and resistance, of secret operations and covert warfare, of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of courage. The Enigma codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who shortened the war in Europe. The French resistance fighters who sabotaged German supply lines before D-Day. The Special Operations Executive Agents parachuted into occupied territory to organize resistance. The partisans in Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, Poland, and across Eastern Europe who tied down hundreds of thousands of Axis troops. The intelligence networks that provided crucial information about enemy plans and capabilities. These operations were kept secret during the war and often remained classified for decades afterward. The British government didn't acknowledge the full extent of the Enigma codebreaking success until the 1970s. The details of many SOE operations remained classified for decades. Soviet partisan operations were celebrated in Soviet propaganda, but the full reality was more complex than the heroic narratives suggested. In our next chapter, we will enter the Shadow War, the world of intelligence, resistance, and secret operations that most civilians never saw, but that was crucial to Allied victory. We will meet the people who fought the war in the shadows, who risked everything knowing that if they were caught, they would be tortured and killed, who received no medals and no recognition because their very existence had to remain secret. This is the war behind the war, the secret operations that shaped history. The shadows await. Imagine you're a young woman in Nazi-occupied France in 1943. You've just received a coded message hidden in a BBC radio broadcast. The long sobs of the violins of autumn wound my heart with a monotonous languor. It sounds like poetry, it is poetry from Verlaine, but you know it means something else entirely. It means tonight at precisely 2:17 a.m., a plane will drop supplies in a field outside your village. It means you need to gather your resistance cell, light signal fires, and pray the Gestapo isn't watching. It means that if you're caught, you'll be tortured until you reveal your comrades' names, then shot or sent to a concentration camp. And yet, you go. Because this is your war, not fought with tanks and artillery, but with codes and courage and the knowledge that one wrong move means death. Now shift your perspective. You're at a country estate in England called Bletchley Park, working in a wooden hut that's freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. You're one of thousands of people, mostly women, who are doing something so secret that you've signed the Official Secrets Act and been told that if you ever reveal what you do here, you'll be prosecuted and imprisoned. You're a codebreaker, and you're reading Adolf Hitler's most secret communications. The messages you're decrypting right now will save thousands of Allied lives, will help sink German U-boats, will prevent German counterattacks, will shorten the war by years. But you can never tell anyone, not your family, not your friends after the war, not even your spouse. You'll carry this secret to your grave because that's what victory requires. Here's what will blow your mind. These two scenarios, the French resistance fighter and the British codebreaker, are connected in ways that neither of them knows. The intelligence gathered by the resistance is being transmitted to London, where it's combined with decrypted German communications to create a picture of enemy dispositions that will guide Allied strategy. The codebreakers are providing information about German responses to resistance activities, helping the resistance know which operations succeeded and which cells have been compromised. It's a web of secret warfare that spans the entire continent, involving hundreds of thousands of people, operating with such secrecy that most of it wouldn't be revealed until decades after the war ended. This is the Shadow War, the conflict fought by spies, saboteurs, resistance fighters, and intelligence analysts. It was a war where a single piece of information could save or cost thousands of lives, where ordinary people performed acts of extraordinary courage, where the weapons were codes and radios and silent knives in the dark. It was a war that most people never saw, but that was absolutely crucial to Allied victory. And it's a war that's been systematically simplified, romanticized, or ignored in popular accounts that focus on the visible war of armies and battles. Let's begin at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion 50 miles north of London that became the site of Britain's greatest secret of World War II. In September 1939, as war was declared, Britain's code-breaking operation moved from London to this country estate, bringing together mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle experts, and other brilliant minds with one purpose: to break the German military codes that protected their most secret communications. The Germans believed their Enigma cipher machine made their communications completely secure. The Enigma looked like a typewriter, but it was far more complex. When an operator pressed a key, electrical current passed through a series of rotors that scrambled the letter according to settings that changed daily. The number of possible settings was astronomical: 158 million possibilities for the military version of the machine. The Germans believed reasonably that even if the Allies captured an Enigma machine, they could never decrypt messages without knowing that day's settings. They were wrong, but their wrongness depended on genius, luck, and contributions from multiple nations that Britain kept secret for decades to protect its intelligence sources. The story begins not at Bletchley, but in Poland. Polish cryptographers, knowing that their country would be first target in any German war, had been working on Enigma since the early 1930s. By 1932, a brilliant young Polish mathematician named Marian Rejewski had figured out the basic workings of Enigma. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Polish cryptographers gave their work to the British and French before fleeing the country. At Bletchley Park, the British built on this Polish foundation. Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician who would later be recognized as one of the founders of computer science, designed an electromechanical device called the bomb that could test possible Enigma settings at high speed, searching for the correct daily key. But the bomb needed help. It couldn't test all possible settings, so codebreakers had to narrow down the possibilities using known phrases that were likely to appear in messages. This is where the human element became crucial. Thousands of people at Bletchley, organized into different huts handling different types of messages, worked in shifts around the clock, analyzing German communications, looking for patterns, identifying probable words, feeding possibilities to the bombs. Most of these workers were women, about 75% of Bletchley's staff, yet for decades after the war, the contribution of these women was minimized or ignored in accounts that focused on the male mathematicians.
The work was mentally exhausting, required absolute concentration, and had to be done under incredible time pressure. Settings changed at midnight, so yesterday's breakthrough was worthless today. A codebreaker might work for hours on a particular message, finally crack it, and discover it was a routine weather report. Or they might crack a message that revealed a major German offensive being planned, information that would immediately be sent to military commanders and that would save hundreds or thousands of lives. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. The British government kept the Enigma breakthrough completely secret, not just during the war, but for 3 decades afterward. The official history of British intelligence in World War II, published in 1979, was the first public acknowledgement of how extensively German codes had been broken. Until then, even most of the people who had worked at Bletchley couldn't talk about what they'd done. Imagine keeping that secret for 35 years, knowing you'd helped win the war in one of the most important ways possible, but never being able to tell anyone, never receiving recognition, watching other people be celebrated for wartime contributions while your contribution remained classified. Why the secrecy? Because Britain continued using variations of the Enigma technology after the war and sold Enigma-type machines to other countries, reading their communications because those countries didn't know Britain had broken the system during the war. The intelligence value of maintaining secrecy was considered more important than giving credit to the people who had actually done the work. But let's be clear about what breaking Enigma actually meant for the war. Historians estimate that the intelligence from Bletchley Park shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years, possibly more. In the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats were sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping and threatening Britain's survival, decrypted messages revealed U-boat positions, allowing convoys to avoid them or allowing Allied aircraft and ships to hunt them. Without this intelligence, Britain might have been starved into submission. Before D-Day, Enigma decrypts revealed German dispositions in France, showing where divisions were located, how they were equipped, and how they were expected to respond to invasion. This intelligence was crucial to Allied planning and helped ensure the invasion's success. On the Eastern Front, British intelligence passed decrypted German communications to the Soviets, though without revealing how they'd obtained it, helping Soviet forces anticipate German offensives. But here's the terrible moral complexity. Sometimes the intelligence had to be ignored to protect the source. If the British acted on every decrypt, the Germans would realize their codes were broken and change systems, cutting off the intelligence flow. So British commanders had to make agonizing choices, allow some ships to be sunk, some attacks to succeed, some soldiers to die, in order to protect the secret that would save more lives in the long run. The most famous example is the bombing of Coventry in November 1940. For decades, a myth circulated that Churchill knew from Enigma decrypts that Coventry would be bombed, but allowed it to happen to protect the secret. This particular story is probably false. The intelligence wasn't specific enough, but the underlying principle was real. Lives were sacrificed to protect intelligence sources. The people making these decisions carried the weight of those choices for the rest of their lives. Now let's leave the codebreakers and travel to occupied France, where a different kind of secret war was being fought by thousands of ordinary French citizens who became resistance fighters. But here's where we need to complicate the romanticized version of the French resistance that popular culture presents. The reality was far more complex, morally ambiguous, and brutal than the image of brave fighters united against Nazi occupation. First, let's acknowledge that most French people didn't actively resist. After France's shocking defeat in 1940, the majority of French citizens tried to survive the occupation by keeping their heads down, following German orders, and waiting for liberation. This wasn't cowardice, it was a rational response to overwhelming force. People had families to feed, children to protect, jobs to maintain. Active resistance meant risking not just your own life, but the lives of everyone you loved. The Nazis made this clear through their policy of collective punishment. If resistance fighters killed a German soldier, the Germans would shoot dozens of French civilians in reprisal. Second, many French people actively collaborated with the Germans. The Vichy government under Marshal Philippe Pétain collaborated extensively, with French police rounding up Jews for deportation, French workers going to Germany to work in factories, French businesses profiting from German contracts. Some collaboration was forced, some was opportunistic, and some reflected genuine belief that Germany would win and France should align accordingly. After the war, France needed to create a narrative of widespread resistance to maintain national pride, but the reality was that collaboration was far more common than heroic resistance. Third, the resistance itself was deeply divided. Communist resistance groups, which became more active after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, fought not just Germans, but also non-communist resistance groups. De Gaulle's Free French tried to coordinate resistance from London, but they had limited control over what actually happened on the ground. Different regions had different resistance organizations with different goals and different methods. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they fought each other. But despite all this complexity, there was genuine resistance, and it was important. Let's follow one particular resistance cell to see how the Shadow War actually worked. In 1943, a British-trained agent named Pearl Witherington was parachuted into occupied France as part of the Special Operations Executive, an SOE organization that conducted sabotage and supported resistance movements. Witherington, a British woman who spoke perfect French, was supposed to serve as a courier for another agent, but when that agent was captured, she took over running a network of about 2,000 resistance fighters in central France. Witherington's group conducted sabotage operations that delayed German reinforcements from reaching Normandy after D-Day. They blew up railway lines, ambushed German convoys, cut telephone lines, and tied down German troops that might otherwise have been fighting the Allied armies. The Germans put a price on Witherington's head, 5 million francs, but she evaded capture and continued operating until the liberation.
Here's what makes this remarkable. Witherington was one of dozens of female SOE agents parachuted into occupied France. These women, including famous agents like Violet Sabo, Noor Inayat Khan, and Nancy Wake, conducted some of the most dangerous missions of the war. They were more likely to be stopped and questioned by the Germans than male agents, because women traveling alone was unusual. If caught, they faced torture by the Gestapo to extract information about other agents and resistance networks, then execution or deportation to concentration camps.
Of the 39 female SOE agents sent to France, 13 were captured and executed. Violette Sabo was captured after a gun battle where she held off German troops to allow resistance fighters to escape, was tortured at Gestapo headquarters in Paris, and was eventually executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Noor Inayat Khan, a Muslim woman and descendant of Indian royalty, served as a radio operator in Paris, was betrayed and captured, and was also executed at Ravensbrück. These women knew the risks and went anyway, performing acts of extraordinary courage that went unrecognized for decades because their operations were classified. The SOE also supported resistance movements across Europe, in Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, and even inside Germany itself. These operations ranged from gathering intelligence to conducting sabotage to organizing and training resistance fighters. Some missions were spectacularly successful, like the sabotage of the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant in Norway in 1943, which disrupted German nuclear research. Others ended in tragedy, like the Englandspiel in the Netherlands, where the Germans captured SOE radio operators and used them to send false messages back to London, leading to the capture of dozens of agents parachuted into German hands. Now let's travel east to see resistance on an entirely different scale. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, partisan warfare involved not dozens or hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of fighters operating across vast territories. Soviet partisans numbered over 1 million by 1944, operating behind German lines, disrupting supply routes, gathering intelligence, and tying down German security forces. But Soviet partisan warfare was brutal and complicated in ways that Soviet propaganda never acknowledged. Many Soviet partisans were soldiers who had been cut off during the German advance and had continued fighting rather than surrender. Others were civilians who had fled into forests to escape German occupation. Still others were political officers sent by Moscow to organize resistance. These groups didn't always cooperate and sometimes fought each other. Moreover, the partisan movement had a dark side that's rarely discussed. Partisans requisitioned food from peasants who could barely feed themselves, sometimes executing those who refused to cooperate. They enforced Stalin's political ideology ruthlessly, executing anyone suspected of collaboration or political deviation, and they operated in a region that was already experiencing ethnic conflict. Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish, Belarusian, and Lithuanian populations had been killing each other since before the war began, and the partisan movement became entangled with these ethnic hatreds. In Poland, the situation was even more complex. The Polish Home Army, loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, fought both the Germans and, increasingly, the Soviet forces advancing from the east. The Warsaw Uprising of August to October 1944, when Polish resistance fighters tried to liberate Warsaw before the Soviets arrived, ended in catastrophe. The Soviet army stopped its advance and waited on the other side of the Vistula River, while the Germans crushed the uprising, killing over 200,000 Poles and destroying much of Warsaw. Stalin wanted Polish resistance destroyed, so it couldn't oppose Soviet domination of Poland after the war, so he let the Germans do the job for him. This is where the moral clarity of World War II becomes deeply muddied. The Soviet Union was an allied power, supposedly fighting for freedom against Nazi tyranny, but Stalin was perfectly willing to let Polish resistance fighters, who were also fighting the Nazis, be massacred because they represented a threat to Soviet post-war control. The Western allies knew this was happening and protested weakly, but did nothing substantive because they needed Soviet military power to defeat Germany. Yugoslavia saw the largest partisan movement in Europe outside the Soviet Union, led by Josip Broz Tito. The Yugoslav partisans numbered several 100,000 at their peak, tying down over a dozen German divisions that might otherwise have been fighting elsewhere. But the Yugoslav resistance was also entangled in a civil war between communist partisans, royalist Chetniks, Croatian fascists, and various ethnic militias. The violence was horrific, with mass executions, ethnic cleansing, and atrocities committed by all sides. When the war ended, Tito had won not just against the Germans, but against his Yugoslav rivals, establishing a communist dictatorship that would rule until the 1990s. In Greece, resistance movements fought the Germans, but also each other, with communist and anti-communist groups killing each other even while the Germans occupied the country. This conflict continued after the Germans withdrew, becoming a full-scale civil war that lasted until 1949. The resistance to Nazi occupation thus led directly into a civil war that killed tens of thousands more Greeks. In Italy, after the Italian government switched sides in 1943, partisan resistance developed in the north, which remained under German occupation. Italian partisans conducted guerrilla warfare, sabotaged infrastructure, and assisted Allied advances. But they also conducted reprisals against fascists and collaborators, executing thousands in extrajudicial killings. After liberation, partisan justice continued, with summary executions of people accused of collaboration, some genuinely guilty, others killed for personal or political reasons. This pattern repeated across occupied Europe. Resistance movements fought not just the occupiers, but also each other, conducted operations that killed civilians as well as Germans, and often devolved into civil wars or ethnic conflicts that continued after the Germans left. The reality of resistance was far more morally complex than the heroic narratives suggest. But let's not lose sight of the genuine courage involved. Whether we're talking about French citizens hiding Jews despite the risk of execution, Polish resistance fighters battling hopeless odds in Warsaw, Soviet partisans blowing up German supply trains, Greek guerrillas ambushing German patrols, Norwegian commandos sabotaging heavy water plants, or Yugoslav partisans tying down German divisions in the mountains, these were ordinary people choosing to fight despite overwhelming risks. The personal costs were staggering. If caught, resistance fighters could expect torture, execution, or deportation to concentration camps. Their families would be punished, children taken to orphanages, spouses imprisoned, parents shot in reprisal. Their villages might be burned in collective punishment. The mortality rate among active resistance fighters was high. In some groups, over half didn't survive the war. Consider the Maquis in France, resistance fighters who lived in rural hideouts and conducted guerrilla operations. They lived in constant fear of betrayal, of German raids, of starvation in winter when food was scarce. They conducted ambushes knowing that German reprisals would kill French civilians. They executed suspected informers, sometimes correctly identifying traitors, others killing innocent people based on false accusations or paranoia. They lived in a moral twilight where every choice was terrible and where survival often meant compromising the very values they were fighting for. Or consider the Jewish resistance fighters in ghettos and concentration camps who fought despite knowing they couldn't win. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April-May 1943, when Jewish fighters armed with homemade weapons and a handful of smuggled guns battled the German forces coming to liquidate the ghetto, was a military defeat but a moral triumph. The fighters knew they would all die. The question was whether to die fighting or to die in the gas chambers. They chose to fight, holding out for nearly a month before the Germans finally crushed the uprising and deported the survivors to Treblinka. There were revolts in several concentration and extermination camps, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, organized by prisoners who knew they were condemned to death and chose to die fighting instead. These uprisings rarely succeeded in the sense of liberating the camps, but they did allow some prisoners to escape, and they demonstrated that even in the most extreme conditions, resistance was possible. Now let's talk about intelligence networks that operated across occupied territory, gathering information that was transmitted to Allied command. These networks required hundreds of people in each country, informants who observed German installations, couriers who carried messages, radio operators who transmitted intelligence, forgers who created false documents, and safe house operators who sheltered agents on the run. One of the most effective networks was the Comet Line, an escape route that helped Allied airmen shot down over occupied Europe to escape to Spain and eventually back to Britain. The line was organized primarily by a young Belgian woman named André de Jong, who personally escorted over 100 airmen to safety before being betrayed and captured. The Comet Line and similar escape routes saved thousands of airmen who could return to combat, but they cost the lives of hundreds of resistance members who were executed when the networks were compromised. The Red Orchestra spy ring in Switzerland provided intelligence to the Soviet Union about German plans on the Eastern Front, intelligence so accurate that Stalin initially suspected it was disinformation. The ring's sources remain mysterious even now, but they apparently included highly placed Germans who opposed Hitler, and the intelligence may have helped the Soviets prepare for German offensives. The Red Orchestra was a Soviet intelligence network operating inside Germany and occupied Europe, providing information to Moscow about German war production, military plans, and political developments. When the Gestapo broke the network in 1942, they arrested hundreds of people. Many were executed, including senior Luftwaffe officer Haro Schulze-Boysen and his wife Libertas, along with dozens of others who had risked everything to oppose Hitler from within. These intelligence networks demonstrate that resistance to Nazism existed even inside Germany, though it was limited and ultimately ineffective at preventing Hitler's crimes. German military officers who opposed Hitler attempted assassinations several times, most famously the July 20, 1944 plot, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in Hitler's conference room. The bomb exploded, but Hitler survived, and the conspirators were rounded up and executed, many hanged with piano wire from meat hooks in a deliberately slow and painful execution that was filmed for Hitler to watch. The July 20 plot revealed that significant opposition to Hitler existed within the German military and intelligence services, but it also revealed how difficult assassination was and how brutal the consequences of failure. The Gestapo arrested over 7,000 people in connection with the plot, executing about 5,000 of them. The bloodbath destroyed what remained of organized resistance inside Germany. Let's shift to the Pacific, where resistance and intelligence operations were equally crucial but receive even less attention. In the Philippines, Filipino guerrillas fought Japanese occupation, gathering intelligence and conducting sabotage that aided the American return in 1944. These guerrillas operated under incredibly difficult conditions, hunted by Japanese forces that conducted brutal reprisals against villages suspected of supporting resistance. In Japanese-occupied China, intelligence networks operated by both nationalist and communist forces gathered information about Japanese dispositions and conducted sabotage operations. The Communist 8th Route Army and New 4th Army in particular developed effective guerrilla tactics, creating liberated zones behind Japanese lines where they could organize the population and train fighters. In Burma and other parts of Southeast Asia, Allied forces organized local resistance groups to gather intelligence and conduct operations behind Japanese lines. The Force 136 operations in Burma and Malaya involved British officers working with local resistance, gathering intelligence that aided Allied offensives. But these operations were complicated by the fact that many locals saw the British as colonial oppressors and weren't eager to fight for Britain's return. In Indonesia, the situation was even more complex. Some Indonesians collaborated with the Japanese, seeing them as liberators from Dutch colonialism. Others formed resistance movements that fought both the Japanese and the Europeans. When the war ended, Indonesian nationalists declared independence, leading to a war against the returning Dutch that lasted until 1949. This pattern of anti-Japanese resistance movements becoming anti-colonial independence movements after the war repeated across Asia. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, worked with Vietnamese resistance against Japan, including with a group led by Ho Chi Minh. After the war, that resistance movement would fight first the French and then the Americans in the wars that would devastate Vietnam for decades. The Shadow War also included deception operations designed to mislead the enemy about Allied intentions. Operation Mincemeat, immortalized in the book and film The Man Who Never Was, involved planting false documents on a corpse dressed as a British officer and allowing it to wash up on the Spanish coast where German intelligence would find it. The documents suggested Allied landings would occur in Greece rather than Sicily, and the Germans fell for it, dispersing forces that might have defended Sicily more effectively. Operation Bodyguard, the deception plan for D-Day, convinced the Germans that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. This involved creating fake armies with inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft, running fake radio traffic, using double agents to feed false information to German intelligence, and even getting the actor M.E. Clifton James, who resembled Montgomery, to make public appearances in the Mediterranean to suggest operations were planned there. The deception was so successful that even after the Normandy landings, Hitler kept powerful forces at Pas-de-Calais for weeks, waiting for the real invasion. The ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park helped Allied commanders understand whether their deception operations were working by allowing them to read German responses to the planted information. This created a feedback loop where intelligence and deception reinforced each other, giving the Allies an enormous advantage in planning operations. But let's return to the human cost of the Shadow War. The people who fought this secret war, the agents parachuted behind enemy lines, the resistance fighters who risked everything, the intelligence analysts who worked in secret, often received no recognition. Many died without their families knowing how they died or what they'd been doing. Many survivors couldn't talk about their war service for decades because it remained classified. The women codebreakers at Bletchley Park returned to civilian life and kept their war work secret, even from their families, for 30 years. When they finally could talk about it, many were elderly or dead, and the historical record had already been written without them. The female SOE agents who survived couldn't discuss their missions for decades. The resistance fighters who had conducted guerrilla operations were sometimes viewed with suspicion after the war, particularly in Eastern Europe, where resistance to the Nazis made people suspect in the eyes of new communist governments. The intelligence war also involved moral compromises that haunt us still. The British and Americans used information obtained through torture of captured German and Japanese personnel. They recruited former Nazis and war criminals because their knowledge of Soviet intelligence was valuable in the emerging Cold War. They made deals with resistance movements that included communists and other groups whose politics they opposed because they needed allies against the Axis. And the Shadow War didn't end when Germany and Japan surrendered. Many of the intelligence networks, resistance movements, and secret operations that fought the Axis became the foundation for Cold War intelligence services and guerrilla movements. The OSS became the CIA. British intelligence services that had fought Germany turned their attention to the Soviet Union. Resistance fighters who had battled fascism found themselves fighting in new conflicts, sometimes against former allies. The Shadow War was crucial to Allied victory. The intelligence shortened the war by years. The resistance tied down hundreds of thousands of Axis troops. The special operations disrupted enemy plans at critical moments. But it was also morally complicated, deeply secret, and often forgotten in popular narratives that focus on the visible war of armies and battles. Understanding this shadow war reveals that World War II wasn't just about military might, but about intelligence, deception, resistance, and the courage of people who fought knowing their contributions might never be acknowledged. It reveals that victory depended on people breaking codes in English country estates, on women parachuting into occupied France, on partisans in Soviet forests, on Filipino guerrillas in jungle hideouts, on German officers who risked everything to oppose Hitler from within. The Shadow War shows us that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people who do extraordinary things in secret, who keep that secret for decades, and who die without recognition because the work they did was too sensitive to acknowledge. Their war was just as real, just as important, and just as worthy of remembrance as the battles that fill our history books.
The shadow war we've explored, fought by code breakers and resistance fighters and intelligence agents, adds complexity to the story of World War II, revealing that victory depended on far more than military battles. But there's another dimension that complicates the narrative of the Good War even further, one that Western education tends to gloss over or present in sanitized form. This is the dimension of Allied moral compromises, the decisions made by the good guys that violated their own principles, that killed civilians deliberately, that imprisoned innocent people because of their race, that maintained colonial oppression while fighting a war supposedly about freedom. These aren't footnotes to the war story or unfortunate but minor aspects. They're central to understanding what the war actually was and what victory actually meant. We're going to talk about strategic bombing that incinerated hundreds of thousands of civilians, about the internment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps, about colonial subjects forced to fight for empires that oppressed them, about the decision to use atomic weapons, about the moral calculus that justified all of this as necessary for victory. This is uncomfortable territory because it complicates the clear moral narrative of World War II, the idea that it was simply a fight of good against evil, democracy against tyranny, with the Allies representing all that was right and just. That narrative isn't completely wrong. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan committed terrible crimes, and stopping them was necessary. But the methods used to stop them sometimes violated the very principles the Allies claimed to be fighting for. In our next chapter, we'll examine these uncomfortable truths, not to create false moral equivalency between the Allies and the Axis, not to suggest that Allied victory wasn't necessary and just, but to understand the full human cost of the war and the moral compromises that victory required. We'll confront the fact that the good war included terrible things done by the good guys, and we'll ask difficult questions about what those decisions mean for how we understand the war. The comfortable certainties are ending. The moral complexities await. On the night of February 13th, 1945, the medieval German city of Dresden was one of the few major cities that had escaped the devastation of strategic bombing. Its Baroque architecture still stood intact, its cultural treasures still preserved. The war was nearly over. Soviet forces were less than 100 miles away. The Germans were clearly defeated, and Dresden was packed with refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army. Then, at 10:13 p.m., British bombers arrived overhead. What happened over the next 15 hours would kill somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 people, create a firestorm that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and incinerate a city that had stood for 800 years. After the war, when asked about the bombing of Dresden, British Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who planned it, said simply, "They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." Now shift forward 5 months to August 6, 1945. At 8:15 a.m., a single American B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, exploded with a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The initial blast killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. The heat was so intense that people were vaporized, leaving only shadows burned into concrete where they had been standing. The radiation would kill tens of thousands more over the following months and years. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 to 75,000 people. When President Truman announced the bombing, he said, "We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans."
Here's the question that should haunt us. Were these decisions, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations with incendiary and atomic weapons, war crimes? Or were they necessary measures to defeat enemies who had themselves committed terrible atrocities and who showed no signs of surrendering? And here's the more disturbing question. Does the fact that we won the war mean we get to decide that our actions were justified while the enemy's identical actions were criminal? This is the territory we're entering now, the moral complexity of World War II that textbooks often ignore or gloss over because it complicates the good war narrative. We're going to talk about Allied strategic bombing that deliberately targeted civilians, killing hundreds of thousands, about Japanese Americans imprisoned in concentration camps because of their race, about colonial powers fighting for freedom while denying it to millions under their rule, about the decision to use atomic weapons, about choices that saved Allied lives but cost enemy civilian lives on a massive scale. And we're going to ask the hard question. If these things had been done by the losing side, would we call them war crimes? And if the answer is yes, what does that tell us about the morality of total war and the concept of justice defined by the victors? Let's begin with strategic bombing, because this is where the moral questions become most acute and where Allied actions most closely resembled the very tactics they condemned when used by the enemy. In the early years of the war, Nazi Germany's bombing of cities, Rotterdam, Warsaw, London, was condemned by the Allies as barbaric terrorism against civilians. British propaganda emphasized that the Nazis were deliberately targeting non-combatants, violating the laws of war, committing atrocities against innocent people. But here's what gets conveniently forgotten. By 1942, Britain was doing the same thing on an even larger scale, and by 1943 to 45, the United States had joined in with bombing campaigns that deliberately targeted civilian populations in both Germany and Japan. The shift happened gradually, justified at each step as necessary for victory, until by the end of the war, the Allies were conducting firebombing raids that killed more civilians in single nights than the Nazis had killed in months of the London Blitz. The evolution of British bombing policy reveals how moral lines can shift under the pressure of total war. In the early months of the war, the Royal Air Force followed rules designed to minimize civilian casualties, targeting only military and industrial sites, and attempting to bomb with precision. But night bombing made precision impossible. Crews couldn't see their targets, navigation was primitive, and bombs often fell miles from their intended targets. Moreover, German air defenses made daytime bombing suicidally dangerous, forcing the RAF to switch to night operations. By 1942, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, newly appointed to lead Bomber Command, had concluded that precision bombing was a fantasy and that the only way bombing could affect the war was through area bombing, destroying entire cities to kill workers, destroy housing, break civilian morale, and disrupt the German war economy. Harris was blunt about what this meant. Burning cities and killing civilians was not an unfortunate side effect, but the actual purpose of the campaign. The first major demonstration of this new policy was the bombing of Lübeck in March 1942. The medieval port city was chosen partly because its old timber buildings would burn easily. The attack created a firestorm that destroyed most of the city center and killed hundreds of civilians. Harris wrote in his report, "Lübeck was not a vital target, but it seemed to me better to destroy an easy target than to fail to destroy a difficult one." 2 months later came the 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne, when the RAF gathered every available aircraft, 1,047 bombers, to demonstrate that it could destroy a major city in a single night. The raid killed about 500 civilians, destroyed 45,000 homes, and left tens of thousands homeless. It was hailed as a great success in Britain, proof that the bomber offensive could hurt Germany. But it was the raid on Hamburg in July 1943, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, that revealed the full horror of what area bombing meant. Over 7 nights, British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of incendiaries on Hamburg, creating a firestorm of unprecedented intensity. The fires created winds of over 150 miles per hour, temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, and a hurricane of flame that consumed 8 square miles of the city. People in bomb shelters died from carbon monoxide poisoning or were incinerated when the shelters became ovens. Those who fled into the streets were caught by the firestorm. Some were lifted off their feet by the winds and hurled into the flames. Others melted into the asphalt that had liquefied in the heat. The death toll at Hamburg was somewhere between 37,000 and 43,000 people, most of them burned to death. Rescue workers found shelters full of bodies shrunken to the size of children from the intense heat. They found human remains baked into the walls of buildings. They found streets filled with corpses of people who had died trying to flee. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later wrote that 6 more attacks like Hamburg would have ended the war. Germany couldn't survive that level of destruction. But the moral question is inescapable. Were these 40,000 people legitimate military targets? The vast majority were civilians, women, children, elderly people who had nothing to do with Hitler's crimes. They were killed deliberately, not as collateral damage, but as the intended targets of a bombing campaign designed to destroy cities and terrorize populations into demanding surrender. Here's where it gets even more complicated. The strategic bombing campaign probably didn't work as intended. Post-war analysis showed that German war production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing, that civilian morale didn't break despite the devastation, and that resources devoted to the bomber offensive, aircraft, crews, bombs, fuel, might have been more effectively used supporting ground operations or interdicting German supply lines. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died in bombing raids that may not have significantly shortened the war. Dresden, which we opened with, epitomizes the moral questions. By February 1945, Germany was clearly defeated. Soviet forces were approaching from the east, Western allies from the west. The war would be over in months. Dresden was a cultural treasure with limited military significance. Yet on the night of February 14th, 15th, British bombers dropped thousands of tons of incendiaries on Dresden, creating yet another firestorm. American bombers followed up with daylight raids over the next 2 days, attacking a city already in ruins and shooting at civilians fleeing the burning city.
The death toll at Dresden is contested and was exaggerated by Nazi propaganda, but modern estimates suggest 25,000 to 40,000 killed. The city was obliterated. Priceless medieval and Baroque architecture burned, and the strategic justification remains unclear. What military purpose did destroying Dresden 3 months before the war ended serve? Churchill himself seems to have had doubts after Dresden, writing a memo questioning whether the bombing of German cities should continue, though he later withdrew the memo after Harris protested. The bombing was so controversial that after the war, while other commanders received peerages and honors, Harris was initially denied such recognition, with the British government apparently embarrassed by the campaign he had conducted on their orders. But if the bombing of Germany is morally troubling, the bombing of Japan is even more so, culminating in the atomic bombings that killed over 200,000 people and introduced humanity to weapons that could end civilization. The air war against Japan followed a similar trajectory to the campaign against Germany, starting with attempts at precision bombing and ending with deliberate firebombing of cities designed to maximize civilian casualties. The shift came when American commanders realized that Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, were incredibly vulnerable to incendiary bombs. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, 334 American B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo with incendiaries, dropping nearly 2,000 tons of bombs that created a firestorm even more devastating than Hamburg. The fires burned so intensely that bomber crews at 6,000 feet could smell burning flesh. The heat was so intense that canals boiled and metal melted. The death toll from this single raid was somewhere between 88,000 and 100,000 people, more than would die at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. another 1,000,000 people were left homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned, including countless homes, temples, schools, and hospitals. The vast majority of victims were civilians who had nothing to do with Japan's military operations or war crimes. And this was just the beginning. Over the following months, American bombers systematically burned dozens of Japanese cities. Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, city after city was subjected to firebombing that killed tens of thousands and left millions homeless. By the summer of 1945, Japan's major cities were largely destroyed, hundreds of thousands of civilians were dead, and American bombers were running out of targets significant enough to bother bombing. The man who planned the firebombing campaign, General Curtis LeMay, was brutally honest about what he was doing. He later said, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." He understood that the deliberate killing of civilians would be considered criminal if done by the losing side, but that victory would provide justification for the same actions. Then came the atomic bombs, weapons so terrible that they changed the fundamental nature of warfare and created the possibility of human extinction. The decision to use atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains one of the most debated questions of the war. Let's be clear about the arguments on both sides, because this isn't a simple moral question.
The case for using the atomic bombs goes like this. Japan showed no sign of surrendering despite devastating conventional bombing and the complete destruction of its Navy and Air Force. American military planners estimated that invading Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives, soldiers and civilians. The Japanese military was preparing to fight to the death, training civilians, including women and children, to resist invasion with bamboo spears if necessary. The atomic bombs, by demonstrating unprecedented destructive power, convinced Emperor Hirohito to override his military leaders and accept surrender, ending the war without an invasion. From this perspective, the atomic bombs, horrible as they were, saved lives overall by ending the war quickly. Truman later claimed the bombs saved over 1 million American lives, and while this number is probably exaggerated, it's plausible that the invasion of Japan would have been extraordinarily bloody. If the bombs shortened the war even by months, they may have saved more Japanese lives than they took, since conventional bombing, blockade, and starvation were killing hundreds of thousands. But here's the counter-argument, which is also compelling. By August 1945, Japan was already defeated. Its cities were burned, its navy destroyed, its air force non-existent, its economy in ruins. The Soviet Union was about to enter the war, which would eliminate any hope of negotiating a conditional surrender. Japan's leaders knew they had lost. The question was what terms they could get, particularly regarding the fate of the emperor. The atomic bombs were dropped on cities full of civilians, not military targets. Hiroshima had some military significance as a command center, but Nagasaki was a secondary target, chosen because the primary target was obscured by clouds. The people who died were overwhelmingly civilians, including thousands of Korean forced laborers who had no say in their government's decisions. Moreover, the bombs were dropped with essentially no warning that would have allowed civilians to evacuate. The United States had been dropping leaflets on Japanese cities warning of conventional bombing, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki received no specific warning about atomic weapons. The people who died had no opportunity to surrender or flee. They simply vaporized or burned to death. Here's what makes this even more morally complex. The decision to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki just 3 days after Hiroshima, before Japan had adequate time to understand what had happened at Hiroshima and to formulate a response, suggests that the bombing wasn't just about ending the war, but about demonstrating American power to the Soviet Union and justifying the enormous expense of the Manhattan Project. Some historians argue that Japan would have surrendered within weeks even without the atomic bombs, once the Soviet Union entered the war and made clear that Japan had no hope of negotiating better terms. From this perspective, the atomic bombings were unnecessary. They killed over 200,000 people to end a war that was already effectively over, and to send a message to the Soviets about America's new weapon. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The bombs did shock Japan into surrender, but Japan might have surrendered soon anyway.
The bombs saved American lives, but at the cost of Japanese civilian lives in a way that raises profound moral questions. The decision was made in the context of total war, where both sides had already accepted that civilians were legitimate targets, but that doesn't make the decision morally unambiguous. What's certain is that if Japan had developed atomic weapons and used them on American cities, we would call it one of history's great crimes. The fact that the United States used them and won the war is the only reason the decision remains defensible to many people. This is what victor's justice means. The winners get to decide which actions were justified and which were criminal. Now let's shift from the bombing campaigns to another uncomfortable truth: the mass imprisonment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps by the United States government. This is taught in American schools, but usually in sanitized form that understates how egregious this violation of civil liberties was, and how it reveals the racism that influenced American wartime decisions. After Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese hysteria swept the West Coast. Despite the fact that there was zero evidence of sabotage or espionage by Japanese Americans, and despite the fact that FBI and military intelligence had already identified and arrested any individuals who posed actual security threats, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, authorizing the military to designate exclusion zones from which any persons could be removed. The order didn't mention Japanese Americans specifically, but that was its sole purpose. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and imprisoned in camps in remote interior locations. They were given days to dispose of their property, often selling homes and businesses for a fraction of their value. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry.
The camps themselves, while not death camps like those the Nazis operated, were concentration camps in the literal sense. Barbed wire, guard towers, armed guards, terrible living conditions with families crowded into single rooms, inadequate food and medical care, and imprisonment without trial or any specific accusation of wrongdoing. People lost their freedom, their property, their dignity, simply because of their ancestry. Here's what makes this particularly damning. German Americans and Italian Americans were not subjected to mass imprisonment, despite Germany and Italy also being enemies. Only people of Japanese ancestry were imprisoned, revealing that this was fundamentally a racist policy, not a legitimate security measure. The government's own reports concluded there was no military necessity for the internment, yet it continued for years. Moreover, while Japanese Americans were imprisoned, the government allowed and even encouraged their sons to volunteer for military service. Over 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the U.S. military during the war, including the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought in Europe and became the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history. Think about that. Young men fought and died for a country that had imprisoned their families without trial. After the war, many Japanese Americans returned to find their property stolen or destroyed, their communities dispersed, their lives ruined. It took until 1988 for the U.S. government to formally apologize and provide modest compensation to survivors. The imprisonment of Japanese Americans stands as one of the most shameful episodes in American history, a reminder that even democracies fighting for freedom can commit grave injustices against their own citizens when fear and racism override constitutional principles. But the internment of Japanese Americans, terrible as it was, wasn't the worst violation of freedom committed by the Allies during the war. That distinction probably belongs to the British Empire's policies in India, particularly the Bengal famine that killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, while India was providing massive support to the Allied war effort. We touched on this in our chapter on the Forgotten Fronts, but we need to examine it more closely because it reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Allied cause, that the nations fighting for freedom from Nazi tyranny were simultaneously maintaining colonial empires that denied freedom to hundreds of millions of people. The Bengal famine of 1943 was caused by a combination of natural disaster, wartime disruption, hoarding and speculation, and catastrophically bad British policies.
When food shortages began developing in Bengal in late 1942, British authorities responded by implementing policies that made the situation worse. They requisitioned rice and boats for military use. They continued exporting food from India. They prioritized stockpiling food for British and Commonwealth forces and for potential famine relief in other parts of the empire. And they refused to divert shipping to bring food aid to Bengal. As people began starving by the hundreds of thousands, British officials minimized the crisis and delayed action. Churchill, as we've mentioned, responded to pleas for food aid with racist comments about Indians breeding like rabbits and questions about why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the famine was so bad. When ships were finally allocated to carry wheat to India, Churchill diverted them to build stockpiles in the Mediterranean instead. The result was one of the worst famines of the 20th century, killing somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, men, women, and children, who starved to death while the colonial power that ruled them prioritized everything else above their lives. This was not deliberate genocide in the way the Holocaust was, but it was a moral catastrophe enabled by racist indifference to the suffering of colonized people.
And this happened while over 2 million Indians were serving in the British military, fighting in Burma, North Africa, Italy, and elsewhere for the freedom of the empire that was letting their families starve. The contradiction is staggering. India was expected to provide unlimited men and resources to fight fascism while remaining unfree itself, and while its people died in a famine that British policies had exacerbated. This contradiction extended across the colonial world. African soldiers fought in Burma and Italy for the freedom of colonial powers that denied them basic rights. Vietnamese and Indonesian resistance fighters battled Japanese occupation only to face European colonial forces trying to reimpose control after Japan's defeat. The Atlantic Charter, proclaimed by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, declared the right of all peoples to self-determination, but Churchill immediately clarified that this didn't apply to the British Empire. The moral bankruptcy of this position became increasingly obvious as the war continued. How could Britain and France credibly claim to be fighting for freedom while maintaining colonial empires based on racial hierarchy and denial of self-determination? The answer is that they couldn't, and the contradiction helped fuel the independence movements that would dismantle European empires in the decades after the war. Let's talk about another uncomfortable aspect of Allied conduct, the treatment of German prisoners of war and civilians after the war ended. While German treatment of Soviet prisoners was monstrous, over 3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity, deliberately starved or worked to death. The Allies also committed violations of the laws of war that deserve acknowledgement. The most controversial case involves German POWs held by the United States in camps along the Rhine in the spring and summer of 1945. Conditions in these camps were terrible. Hundreds of thousands of men held in open fields with minimal food, water, or shelter. Estimates of deaths in American-run POW camps range from the official figure of about 3,000 to claims of tens of thousands, though the higher numbers are disputed and probably exaggerated. What's not disputed is that conditions were deliberately kept harsh, partly due to logistical challenges of suddenly having millions of POWs, partly due to desire to punish Germans, and partly due to a controversial decision to classify many POWs as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, allowing the U.S. to avoid certain Geneva Convention obligations. Whether this constituted a war crime or just harsh treatment is debated, but it's clear that some German POWs suffered terribly in Allied custody. The treatment of German civilians in the immediate post-war period also raises moral questions. The Allied bombing had already killed hundreds of thousands and left millions homeless. After the war, millions more were expelled from Eastern Europe in a forced population transfer that killed hundreds of thousands through disease, starvation, and violence. Somewhere between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were forced to leave Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries, creating a humanitarian crisis. These expulsions were agreed to by the Allied powers at Potsdam and were seen as preventing future conflict by creating ethnically homogeneous states, but they involved massive suffering and death. Entire populations were uprooted, with people given hours or days to leave homes their families had occupied for generations. Many died on the march from exposure, disease, or violence. Children were separated from parents. Elderly people died by the roadside. The desire to punish Germany is understandable given Nazi crimes, but collective punishment of civilians violates fundamental principles of justice. German children who starved in 1945 hadn't committed any crimes. They were simply born on the wrong side of a war their parents had started or supported. Similar forced population transfers occurred across Eastern Europe as borders were redrawn and ethnic populations moved. Poles were expelled from territories annexed by the Soviet Union. Ukrainians were expelled from Poland. Millions of people across Europe were forcibly relocated in the largest forced population movement in European history. The human cost was enormous, but it's often presented as a necessary evil to create stability rather than as a moral catastrophe that punished innocent people for their ethnicity. Let's also address the moral compromises involved in Allied dealings with the Soviet Union. The Western Allies needed Soviet military power to defeat Germany. The Eastern Front is where the vast majority of German forces fought and died, and Soviet victory there was essential to Allied success. But alliance with Stalin required overlooking or minimizing his crimes, which were comparable in scale to Hitler's. Stalin had killed millions in purges, forced collectivization, and the Gulag system. Soviet occupation of eastern Poland in 1939, done in collaboration with Nazi Germany through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, involved mass arrests and deportations. The Katyn massacre, where Soviet forces murdered over 20,000 Polish officers and intellectuals in 1940, was a war crime that the Soviets blamed on the Germans and that the Western Allies pretended to believe to maintain the alliance. When Soviet forces advanced into Eastern Europe in 1944-1945, they committed mass rapes and atrocities against German civilians on a scale that shocked even hardened observers. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers, with tens of thousands murdered. This was partly revenge for German atrocities in the Soviet Union, but it was mass sexual violence that the Soviet command did little to prevent and sometimes actively encouraged. The Western Allies knew about these crimes, but chose not to make them a major issue because they needed Soviet cooperation and because they were preparing to divide Europe into spheres of influence. At Yalta and Potsdam, Roosevelt and Churchill effectively agreed to Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, condemning millions to decades of communist dictatorship. The moral calculation was that defeating Nazi Germany required alliance with Stalin, regardless of his crimes, and that Soviet domination of Eastern Europe was an acceptable price for victory over Hitler. But for the people of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states, liberation by the Soviets meant replacing Nazi occupation with Soviet occupation, with little genuine freedom resulting from Allied victory. Perhaps the most morally complex aspect of World War II is the question of whether any alternatives existed to the choices the Allies made. Could the war have been fought without strategic bombing of civilians? Probably not, without prolonging the war and costing more Allied lives. Could the war have been won without alliance with Stalin? Probably not. Soviet forces did the majority of the fighting against Germany. Could Japan have been defeated without atomic weapons? Possibly, but an invasion would have been catastrophic. The uncomfortable truth is that total war, fought between industrial nations mobilizing entire populations and economies, creates impossible moral choices. When the enemy is mobilizing civilians for war production, bombing factories means killing workers. When the enemy will fight to the death, achieving victory means killing on a massive scale. When you need an ally as brutal as Stalin, you overlook his crimes to defeat an enemy you consider more threatening. This doesn't make the decisions unambiguously right, but it explains why people making decisions under extreme circumstances chose courses of action that violated peacetime moral standards. The alternative, losing to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, was unacceptable, so Allied leaders made choices that sacrificed enemy civilians, violated civil liberties, maintained colonial oppression, and allied with a dictator nearly as murderous as the one they were fighting. The lesson isn't that the Allies were morally equivalent to the Axis. They weren't. Nazi Germany's deliberate genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others, Japan's atrocities across Asia, the fundamental evil of fascist ideology, these remain clear moral distinctions. The Allies were fighting against genuine evil, and their victory was necessary and just. But the methods used to achieve that victory included terrible things: deliberate killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians through bombing, imprisonment of innocent people based on race, maintenance of colonial empires that denied freedom to millions, alliance with a dictator who murdered millions, and post-war policies that caused massive suffering. Understanding these complexities doesn't diminish Allied achievement in defeating fascism. It does require us to acknowledge that even just wars involve moral compromises, that victory is written by those who survive to tell the story, and that the good war was more morally ambiguous than the simplified narratives suggest. The moral complexities we've explored, the strategic bombing, the internment, the colonial contradictions, the alliance with Stalin, reveal that World War II resists simple moral narratives. But there's another dimension of the war's moral complexity that's even more systematically ignored: the other victims, the groups who suffered terribly but whose stories are rarely told because they complicate or compete with the narratives we're more comfortable with. When we talk about World War II's victims, certain groups receive extensive attention, and rightly so. The 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, the millions of Soviet citizens killed by German invasion, Allied soldiers who died fighting fascism. These losses deserve to be remembered and honored. But millions of others died whose stories are largely forgotten. The Romani people, murdered in what they call the Porozhymos, their Holocaust, with death tolls estimated at 200,000 to 500,000 or more. Disabled people, killed in Nazi euthanasia programs that foreshadowed the death camps. The millions of Slavic civilians deliberately targeted by Nazi ideology, colonial soldiers whose service has been written out of the histories written by the nations they served, the forced sexual slaves, the forced laborers worked to death in mines and factories across the Axis empires. These people suffered and died just as terribly as those we remember, but their suffering has been marginalized or forgotten because it doesn't fit neatly into the narratives we tell about the war. In our next chapter, we will recover these lost stories, we will name the forgotten victims, and we will ask why some suffering is remembered while other suffering is erased.
This won't be comfortable. These are stories of suffering on scales difficult to comprehend, of crimes that continued after the perpetrators were defeated, of injustices that were never adequately addressed because the world moved on to new conflicts. But these stories deserve to be told, and the victims deserve to be remembered. The forgotten victims await. Their stories demand our attention. There's a question that reveals everything about how we remember World War II. How many people died in the Holocaust? Most people immediately answer 6 million Jews, and they're right, but they're also wrong. Because 6 million Jews were murdered, yes, but they weren't the only victims of the Nazi genocide. The Nazis also killed somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 Romani people, over 200,000 disabled people in organized euthanasia programs, millions of Soviet prisoners of war deliberately starved to death, millions of Polish and Soviet civilians murdered in mass shootings and reprisals, tens of thousands of political opponents and resistance fighters, thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses, an unknown number of gay men and lesbians, and countless
others deemed unworthy of life by Nazi racial ideology. The total number of people murdered in the Nazi genocide was somewhere between 11 and 17 million people. 6 million were Jews, and their suffering must never be forgotten or minimized. But there were millions of other victims whose stories have been systematically marginalized, whose suffering is barely acknowledged, whose deaths are not commemorated with memorials and museums, and whose descendants are still fighting for recognition of what was done to their families. Now shift your attention east to Asia, where the victims are even more numerous and even more forgotten. When we talk about Japanese war crimes, we usually mention Pearl Harbor and maybe the Bataan Death March if we had a good history teacher. But do you know about the tens of thousands of women, mostly Korean, but also Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, and from across occupied Asia, who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military? Do you know about the Chinese laborers worked to death building Japanese infrastructure projects, the Filipino civilians massacred in Manila, the hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asians who died building the Burma Railway, the victims of biological warfare experiments that rival anything the Nazis did? Here's the pattern that should make you angry. The victims who look like us, who share our ethnicity or nationality or religion, are remembered and honored. The victims who are different, who come from groups already marginalized before the war, who lived in places far from centers of power, or who suffered at the hands of allies we needed after the war, their suffering is forgotten, footnoted, or actively suppressed. The Roma have no Holocaust museum in Washington. The comfort women received no justice at the Tokyo trials. The millions of Chinese civilians murdered by Japan are barely mentioned in Western education. This is the story of the other victims, the forgotten dead, the people whose suffering was just as terrible but whose stories we don't tell because they complicate the narratives we prefer. This is about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, and why that choice reveals as much about us as it does about the war.
Let's begin with the Romani people, often pejoratively called gypsies, who were targeted by the Nazis for total extermination just as the Jews were, yet whose genocide remains largely unknown even to educated people. The Romani referred to their Holocaust as the parajmos, the devouring, and estimates of how many died range from 200,000 to 500,000 or more, with some scholars suggesting that as many as half of Europe's Romani population was murdered. The uncertainty in these numbers itself tells a story about how the Romani genocide has been marginalized. For the Jewish Holocaust, we have extensive documentation, meticulous German records, survivor testimonies collected and preserved, and decades of historical research that has established death tolls with reasonable precision. For the parajmos, we have fragmentary records, limited research until recent decades, and far fewer survivor testimonies preserved because nobody considered Romani voices worth recording. The Nazi persecution of Roma began with the same pseudo-scientific racism that targeted Jews. Nazi racial theorists classified Roma as racially inferior, as asocials whose very existence contaminated German society, and as people who should be prevented from reproducing and ultimately eliminated. The 1935 Nuremberg laws that stripped Jews of citizenship also applied to Roma. Like Jews, Roma were forbidden to marry Germans, were excluded from public life, and were increasingly persecuted. But in some ways, the Romani experience was even worse because they were more vulnerable. They lacked the institutional structures, the international connections, and the economic resources that at least some Jewish communities possessed. Many Roma were already living on the margins of society, victims of discrimination that predated the Nazis by centuries. When the Nazis came for them, there was no one with power to object. In 1938, Heinrich Himmler ordered the fight against the Gypsy Plague to begin. Roma were required to register with authorities, were subjected to racial examinations by Nazi doctors, and were increasingly arrested and sent to concentration camps. By 1940, deportations had begun. In May 1940, 2,500 Roma from Germany were deported to occupied Poland, the first mass deportation of Roma in what would become a genocide. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and the Einsatzgruppen began mass shootings of Jews, they also murdered Roma. In occupied Yugoslavia, Serbia, and elsewhere, Roma were shot alongside Jews in mass executions. At Babi Yar in Ukraine, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in September 1941, Roma were also killed in the ravine, though their deaths are rarely mentioned in accounts that focus on Jewish victims. Roma were sent to virtually every major concentration camp. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Nazis established a gypsy family camp where Roma were imprisoned together, one of the few instances where the Nazis allowed families to remain together in camps. This wasn't mercy, but rather facilitated their eventual murder. On August 2, 1944, the Nazis liquidated the gypsy camp at Auschwitz, sending 2,897 Roma to the gas chambers in a single night. The victims included hundreds of children. The killing of Roma at Auschwitz-Birkenau alone numbered at least 20,000, though estimates go higher. At other camps, Chelno, Sobibor, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, Roma were murdered in gas chambers, died from disease and starvation, or were worked to death. Dr. Josef Mengele conducted horrific medical experiments on Romani children at Auschwitz, just as he did on Jewish twins.
In occupied territories, Roma were murdered in mass shootings. In Croatia, the fascist Ustaše regime killed tens of thousands of Roma along with Serbs and Jews. In Romania, hundreds of thousands of Roma were deported to Transnistria, where tens of thousands died from disease, starvation, and murder. In Serbia, the Nazis killed virtually the entire Romani population. Across Eastern Europe, Roma communities that had existed for centuries were completely destroyed. Yet, after the war, Romani suffering was barely acknowledged. At the Nuremberg trials, the Romani genocide was mentioned only in passing. Romani survivors were largely excluded from compensation programs that provided restitution to Jewish survivors. When memorials were built to Holocaust victims, Roma were often not mentioned or were grouped under vague categories like other victims. The first memorial specifically to murdered Roma wasn't erected at Auschwitz until 1982, nearly 40 years after the war. Why was Romani suffering forgotten when Jewish suffering was extensively documented and memorialized? Partly because Roma lacked the institutional structures to demand recognition. They had no state advocating for them, no international organizations documenting their losses. Partly because the racism that had made them vulnerable to Nazi genocide continued after the war. They were still seen as marginal, unimportant, not worthy of attention. And partly because focusing on Jewish victims created a clearer narrative about racial anti-Semitism, while acknowledging Roma victims complicated the story by revealing that the Nazis targeted multiple groups for extermination. Only in recent decades has the Porajmos begun receiving the recognition it deserves, largely through the advocacy of Romani organizations and scholars who have fought to have their history acknowledged. But even now, most people have never heard of the Porajmos, couldn't tell you how many Roma were murdered, and don't know that the Nazi genocide targeted multiple groups for total extermination. Now let's talk about another group of Nazi victims whose suffering is systematically minimized: disabled people, who were the first victims of the Nazi program of mass murder that would eventually become the Holocaust. The Nazi euthanasia program, known by the codename Action T4, murdered over 200,000 disabled children and adults between 1939 and 1945. This program pioneered the techniques of mass murder, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the bureaucratic systems of deception that would later be used to kill Jews, Roma, and others. The ideological foundation for murdering disabled people came from Nazi beliefs about racial purity and the need to eliminate life unworthy of life. Nazi propaganda portrayed disabled people as burdens on society, as useless eaters consuming resources needed for healthy Germans, and as threats to the genetic health of the race. Films like Ich klage an, I accuse, promoted the idea that killing disabled people was a mercy, that they would want to die rather than live with disabilities. The program began with disabled children.
Parents were encouraged to bring children with disabilities to special pediatric clinics where they would supposedly receive excellent care. Instead, the children were killed through starvation, lethal injection, or overdoses of sedatives. The parents were told their children had died of natural causes like pneumonia. In 1939, the program expanded to include disabled adults. 6 killing centers were established in Germany and Austria, where disabled people from psychiatric hospitals, nursing homes, and other institutions were murdered. Patients were transported to these centers in gray buses, given cursory examinations, and then sent to gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Carbon monoxide piped in from cylinders or from engine exhaust killed them, their bodies were cremated, and their families received letters explaining that they had died of natural causes and had been cremated for public health reasons.
The staff at these killing centers, doctors, nurses, administrators, were later transferred to the death camps in occupied Poland, where they used the same techniques to murder Jews. The gas chambers at Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Treblinka were designed and operated by people who had learned their trade killing disabled Germans. The Holocaust of the Jews was built on the foundation of the murder of disabled people. Public opposition eventually forced the Nazis to officially halt T4 in 1941, though killings continued in decentralized form throughout the war. This opposition, largely from Catholic clergy in some families, demonstrates that resistance was possible, that the Nazi regime could be pressured to change policies when enough people objected. But the opposition came too late for over 70,000 people already murdered in the official T4 program, and it didn't extend to protecting Jews or Roma. After the war, the murder of disabled people received minimal attention at the Nuremberg trials. Only a few perpetrators were prosecuted. Disabled survivors and their families received little compensation. The facilities where the murders occurred were rarely memorialized. Society preferred to forget that disabled people had been systematically murdered, and the victims had no powerful advocates demanding recognition. Even today, many people don't know that the Nazis killed hundreds of thousands of disabled people. Holocaust education focuses overwhelmingly on Jewish victims, with Roma, disabled people, and other groups relegated to footnotes, if mentioned at all. This reflects ongoing ableism, the assumption that disabled lives matter less, that their suffering is less important, and that their deaths are less worth remembering. Let's shift our attention to another category of victims: Slavic peoples, particularly Poles and Soviet citizens, who were targeted by Nazi ideology for enslavement and eventual extermination. Hitler's vision for Eastern Europe, laid out explicitly in Mein Kampf and elaborated in planning documents for Operation Barbarossa, called for the Slavic population to be enslaved, worked to death, or killed to create living space, Lebensraum, for German settlers. The General Plan Ost, the General Plan for the East, developed by Nazi planners, called for the death or deportation of tens of millions of Slavs. The plan projected that 30 to 45 million people in Poland, the Soviet Union, and other Eastern European countries would need to be eliminated to make room for German colonization. Some would be worked to death as slave labor, some would be deliberately starved, some would be murdered outright, and the few considered sufficiently Germanic might be forcibly assimilated. This wasn't just theoretical planning, it was being implemented throughout the war. In Poland, the Nazis launched an extraordinary pacification action in 1939 through 40 that murdered tens of thousands of Polish intellectuals, clergy, teachers, and political leaders, anyone who might lead resistance to German occupation. The goal was to reduce Poland to a nation of laborers serving German masters. In the Soviet Union, the scale of deliberate killing was even larger. When German forces invaded in 1941, they brought with them Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, that murdered over 1 million people, most of them Jews, but also communist officials, intellectuals, and Romani people. The German army's treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was deliberately genocidal. Of approximately 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured by Germany, somewhere between 3.3 and 3.5 million died in German captivity, most from deliberate starvation. Think about that number. Over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war murdered through starvation and neglect. That's a death toll comparable to the total number of Jews killed at Auschwitz. Yet these deaths are rarely emphasized in Holocaust education because they don't fit the racial extermination narrative as clearly. They were prisoners of war, even though their treatment violated all laws of war and constituted deliberate mass murder. German occupation policies in the Soviet Union included deliberate starvation of cities. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted 872 days from 1941 to 1944, killed over 1 million Soviet civilians, most from starvation. This wasn't collateral damage from military operations, but deliberate policy. The Germans planned to starve the city into submission, with planning documents explicitly stating that the population of Leningrad should be allowed to starve. Soviet civilians were also murdered in anti-partisan operations that often involved the destruction of entire villages suspected of supporting partisans. In Belarus alone, the Germans destroyed over 9,000 villages, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The village of Khaten, destroyed in 1943 with 149 residents burned alive in a barn, became a symbol of these atrocities, but it was one of thousands of villages destroyed in similar fashion. The total civilian death toll in the Soviet Union was somewhere between 10 and 15 million people, in addition to military deaths of 8 to 10 million. These deaths resulted from a combination of German occupation policies designed to exploit and destroy the Soviet population, combat operations that showed callous disregard for civilian life, and deliberate murder of civilians seen as threats to German control. Yet Soviet civilian suffering is often minimized or ignored in Western accounts of World War II, partly because Cold War politics made the Soviet Union an enemy rather than an ally to be memorialized, partly because the scale of suffering is so vast it's difficult to comprehend, and partly because acknowledging Soviet suffering complicates narratives that focus on Western Allied liberation. Polish suffering is similarly marginalized. Poland lost approximately 6 million people during the war, roughly 17% of its pre-war population, the highest percentage of any nation. About 3 million of the dead were Polish Jews, but the other 3 million were Polish Christians murdered in camps, in mass executions, in the Warsaw Uprising, in forced labor, and from starvation and disease caused by German occupation. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944, which we mentioned earlier, saw the Germans systematically destroy the city after crushing the Polish resistance, killing over 200,000 Poles. After the uprising, the Germans deliberately demolished what remained of Warsaw, destroying 85% of the city's buildings. This wasn't military necessity, but deliberate annihilation of a national capital. Yet Polish suffering is often obscured by focusing exclusively on the Jewish Holocaust, and Polish collaboration in some areas is emphasized, while Polish resistance and victimhood are minimized. The complexity of Polish-Jewish relations during the war, instances of both heroic rescue and terrible betrayal, is flattened into simple narratives that don't acknowledge the multiple dimensions of suffering and resistance.
Now let's cross from Europe to Asia, where the victims are even more numerous and even more systematically forgotten by Western memory. We need to talk about the comfort women, a euphemism that sanitizes World War II's most horrific crimes, the systematic sexual slavery of hundreds of thousands of women by the Japanese military. The Japanese military, operating across its empire, from China to Korea to the Philippines to Indonesia and beyond, established a system of military brothels where women were forced to provide sexual services to Japanese soldiers. The number of women subjected to this system is debated, but estimates range from 50,000 to over 200,000. Most were Korean, but significant numbers were Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Dutch, and from other occupied territories. Many of these women were kidnapped or deceived, promised factory jobs or other work, then transported to military brothels where they were imprisoned and raped by dozens of men daily.
Some were as young as 13 or 14 years old. They lived in conditions of absolute horror. subjected to repeated rape, beatings, disease, and in many cases murder when they were no longer useful or when Japanese forces retreated and wanted to eliminate evidence of the system. Survivors describe being raped 30, 40, or 50 times a day, every day for months or years. They describe forced abortions, sterilization, violence so severe it caused permanent injury. They describe women who died from disease or violence, or who committed suicide to escape the horror. They describe being treated as objects, as things for soldiers to use and discard, with no recognition of their humanity. After the war, most survivors never spoke about what had been done to them. The shame and trauma were too great, and societies across Asia stigmatized rape victims, making it nearly impossible for women to acknowledge what they had endured. Many survivors never married, never had children, lived with physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And here's what makes this even more unconscionable. For decades, the Japanese government denied that the comfort women's system was official policy, claimed that the women were voluntary prostitutes, and refused to acknowledge responsibility or provide compensation. Only in the 1990s, after survivors began publicly testifying and documentary evidence emerged, did the Japanese government issue partial acknowledgments. But these have been repeatedly qualified, and conservative Japanese politicians continue to deny or minimize what happened. The comfort women were not mentioned at the Tokyo war crimes trials after the war. The United States, which occupied Japan and controlled the trials, chose not to prosecute sexual slavery because they wanted Japan as an ally against communism, and because there was little public sympathy for Asian women who had been sexually brutalized. Some U.S. occupation forces even used comfort stations themselves after the war. This means that one of the war's most systematic crimes against women received no justice, no compensation for most survivors, and was actively suppressed in historical memory for decades. It took the courage of survivors who, in their 60s and 70s, finally broke their silence and demanded recognition to bring the comfort women system into public consciousness. Many of these women have now died without receiving the justice they deserved. The comfort women's system reveals how wartime sexual violence against women is systematically minimized, how Asian women's suffering is particularly invisible in Western memory, and how the needs of post-war political alliances trump justice for victims of war crimes. Let's talk about forced labor, another category of victimhood that involved millions of people but receives limited attention. The Nazis and Japanese both used forced labor on massive scales, working people to death in a system that treated humans as disposable resources. In the Nazi system, somewhere between 12 and 15 million people were used as forced laborers. Soviet POW, concentration camp inmates, civilians from occupied territories, Jews in ghettos, and others. They worked in German factories, mines, farms, and construction projects under conditions that killed hundreds of thousands. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, Volkswagen, BMW, and many others used forced laborers, working them until they died and then requesting replacements from SS suppliers. The Japanese forced labor system was similarly vast. Millions of people, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Indonesian, and prisoners of war from allied nations, were forced to work on construction projects in mines and factories. The Burma Railway, which we discussed earlier, was just one of many projects where forced laborers died by the tens of thousands. In China, forced labor for Japanese projects killed hundreds of thousands. In Korea, hundreds of thousands were forcibly conscripted for labor in Japan and Japanese-occupied territories. After the war, some compensation was provided to forced laborers, but it was often minimal and came decades late. German companies paid into compensation funds only after years of legal battles. The Japanese government has been even more resistant to acknowledging and compensating forced laborers, particularly Korean and Chinese victims. Many survivors died before receiving any compensation, and the amounts provided were often insultingly small compared to the suffering inflicted. The forced labor system reveals that Nazi and Japanese crimes weren't just about racial extermination, but about treating entire populations as resources to be exploited until exhausted and then discarded. The people who died in these systems worked to death in mines, starved in labor camps, killed when they became too weak to work, deserve to be remembered alongside those who died in gas chambers and mass executions. Let's not forget the victims of biological warfare and medical experiments. We mentioned Unit 731 earlier, but we need to examine it more closely because it represents crimes as terrible as anything the Nazis did. Yet it's far less known because it occurred in China, and because the United States granted immunity to the perpetrators in exchange for their research data. Unit 731 was a Japanese biological warfare unit based in Manchuria that conducted horrific experiments on living human subjects, mostly Chinese but also Soviet and Korean prisoners. The experiments included vivisection, cutting open living people without anesthesia to observe their organs and see how they functioned while the victim was still alive. Pregnant women were vivisected to study fetal development. People were infected with diseases and then dissected alive to see how the diseases affected different organs. Freezing experiments. Forcing people to stand in freezing temperatures with bare arms or legs, then testing different methods of treating frostbite, including pouring boiling water on frozen limbs or holding them over fires to see what happened to the tissue. Pressure chamber experiments. Putting people in pressure chambers and increasing pressure until their eyes popped out of their sockets or decreasing pressure until organs burst. Biological weapons testing, infecting people with anthrax, plague, cholera, and other diseases to test weaponized pathogens. Some prisoners were tied to stakes in fields while bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were detonated overhead. The number of people killed by Unit 731 is uncertain, but estimates suggest at least 3,000. And possibly over 10,000 people died in the experiments, with thousands more killed by biological weapons tested in Chinese villages. After the war, the United States granted immunity to the leaders of Unit 731 in exchange for their experimental data. They were never prosecuted as war criminals because the U.S. military wanted the biological warfare research. The commander of Unit 731, General Shiro Ishii, lived freely in Japan until his death in 1959. The data from his experiments, obtained through the torture and murder of thousands, became part of U.S. biological warfare research. This represents a profound moral failure by the United States, granting immunity to people who committed crimes comparable to Mengel's experiments at Auschwitz, because their research was considered valuable. It also meant that these crimes received minimal attention in the Tokyo trials and remained largely classified for decades. We should also acknowledge the victims of the atomic bombings whose suffering extended far beyond the initial death toll. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as hibakusha, faced radiation sickness, elevated cancer rates, birth defects in their children, and severe social discrimination. Many Japanese people avoided marrying hibakusha for fear that radiation exposure had damaged their genes. Survivors suffered not just physical injuries but social stigmatization that lasted their entire lives. The United States conducted studies of hibakusha to understand radiation effects, but provided minimal medical care to the victims. These people had suffered terrible injuries from American weapons, and the United States studied them like laboratory specimens rather than helping them, adding another layer of victimization. Let's also remember the victims of mass famine caused by wartime policies. We discussed the Bengal famine, but there were others. The Vietnamese famine of 1944-45 killed 1 to 2 million people due to Japanese occupation policies that forced farmers to grow industrial crops instead of rice. The Dutch famine of 1944-45, known as the Hunger Winter, killed over 20,000 people when Germans blockaded food supplies to punish Dutch resistance. The Greek famine of 1941-44 killed over 300,000 people as Axis occupation disrupted food supplies. These famine victims died because wartime policies, occupation, and military operations destroyed the systems that fed civilian populations. They were indirect victims of the war, but their deaths were no less real and no less tragic than those who died from bullets and bombs. We need to acknowledge the children who were victims of the war, not just those killed in bombing or in concentration camps, but those who lost their parents, their homes, their childhoods. Millions of children across Europe and Asia grew up as orphans, in refugee camps, in occupied territories, traumatized by violence they witnessed. The psychological damage to an entire generation of children has rarely been fully examined. There were also victims who suffered after the war ended. Displaced persons, millions of people uprooted by the war who couldn't or wouldn't return home, lived in camps for years after the war, in limbo, unwanted by any country. Jewish survivors who returned home sometimes found their property stolen and their communities destroyed, facing continuing anti-Semitism that made them refugees in their own countries. Germans expelled from Eastern Europe died by the hundreds of thousands in forced population transfers. Japanese civilians who had colonized Manchuria and Korea were expelled, sometimes dying in the process. The selective remembering of some victims while forgetting others reveals the politics of memory. The victims who are remembered tend to be those whose suffering fits narratives that serve contemporary political purposes, who have powerful advocates demanding recognition, who come from groups with social and political power, or whose victimization doesn't complicate relationships with important allies. The victims who are forgotten tend to be those from marginalized groups, those whose suffering occurred at the hands of nations that became allies after the war, those who lacked institutional structures to preserve their memory, or those whose victimization complicates simple moral narratives about the war. Roma people, disabled people, Slavic civilians, comfort women, forced laborers, victims of biological experiments, famine victims, children orphaned and traumatized, all these people suffered terribly, all deserve to be remembered. And all have been systematically marginalized in favor of memories that are more comfortable or politically useful. Understanding this selective memory doesn't diminish the suffering of those who are remembered. The 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, the millions of Soviet soldiers who died defeating Germany, the Allied soldiers who liberated Europe. Their sacrifices remain genuine and worthy of honor. But honoring their memory shouldn't require forgetting others who suffered just as terribly, but whose stories complicate the narratives we prefer to tell. The lesson is that memory is political, that some suffering is deemed more important than other suffering, that whose stories get told reveals whose humanity we recognize and whose we ignore. Every victim of the war, Jew and Roma, disabled German and Soviet prisoner, Chinese civilian and Korean comfort woman, Jewish child gassed at Auschwitz and Chinese prisoner vivisected at Unit 731, was equally human, suffered equally terribly, and deserves equal recognition. But that recognition has not been equal, and confronting that inequality forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about whose lives we value and whose we don't. As we approach the end of this journey through the untold stories of World War II, we've confronted truths that complicate and deepen our understanding of the war. We've seen that the conflict was truly global, fought on fronts that Western education ignores. We've learned about the shadow war of intelligence and resistance. We've acknowledged Allied moral compromises that violated the very principles the war was supposedly thought to defend. And we've remembered victims whose suffering has been systematically forgotten because it doesn't fit comfortable narratives. But there's one more illusion we need to shatter: the idea that the war ended in 1945. For millions of people, the war's end brought not peace but new conflicts, new suffering, and new crises that would shape the world for decades to come. The years from 1945 to 1950 saw war crimes trials that delivered selective justice, a displaced persons crisis involving millions of refugees, independence movements that exploded across the colonial world, and the beginning of the Cold War that would structure global politics for the next 45 years. Victory in 1945 didn't mean the same thing for everyone. For Americans and Western Europeans, it meant liberation and the beginning of prosperity. For Eastern Europeans, It meant replacing Nazi occupation with Soviet domination. For colonized peoples who had fought for the Allies, it meant watching colonial powers try to reimpose control. For millions of displaced persons, it meant years in refugee camps waiting for countries to accept them. For Germans and Japanese, it meant occupation, devastation, and the painful process of confronting what their nations had done. In our final chapter, we'll explore the war that didn't end, the immediate aftermath that created the world we live in today, the justice that was partial and selective, the conflicts that emerged from victory, and the legacies that still shape our world 80 years later. We'll see that the end of World War II was not a clean conclusion, but a messy, complicated transition that created as many problems as it solved. The war is ending, but its consequences are just beginning. The final chapter awaits. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Across the Western world, people poured into the streets to celebrate. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, cheering for King George VI and Winston Churchill. In New York, Times Square filled with jubilant Americans kissing strangers and waving flags. In Paris, the Champs-Élysées overflowed with French citizens celebrating liberation. The photographs from VE Day show pure joy, relief, celebration. The war was over, the good guys had won, and peace had finally arrived. But now imagine a different scene on that same day. One that wasn't photographed for Life magazine. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, a young woman who survived Auschwitz walks out of the camp gates, skeletal and sick, to discover that her entire family is dead, her hometown no longer exists as she knew it, and she has nowhere to go. Soviet soldiers are occupying her country, a different kind of occupation than the Nazis, but an occupation nonetheless. She has no home, no family, no country that wants her. The war may be over, but for her, there is no peace, no celebration, no return to normal life. Or picture this. A Chinese family in Nanjing, 8 years after the Japanese invasion, hears that Japan has surrendered. The celebration is real. The occupation that killed hundreds of thousands is finally ending. But their city is in ruins. The economy has collapsed. And now a civil war between nationalists and communists is about to tear China apart for another 4 years. The war against Japan is over, but the violence continues. Here's the truth that gets buried under the celebrations and the ticker tape parades. For most of the world, the war didn't end in 1945. It transformed into different conflicts, created crises that lasted years or decades, and left wounds that have never fully healed. The years from 1945 to 1950 saw Europe divided by an iron curtain that would last 45 years. Trials that delivered justice to some war criminals while recruiting others to work for the victors. A displaced persons crisis involving over 11 million refugees. Independence wars across Asia and Africa as colonial empires crumbled. And the beginning of a Cold War that brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. This is the story of how victory became occupation, how justice became selective, how liberation became a new kind of subjugation for millions, and how the war's end created the world we still live in today. This is the story of the war that didn't end.
Let's begin with what should have been the moment of clarity and justice, the war crimes trials that were supposed to hold the perpetrators accountable and establish the principle that crimes against humanity would be punished regardless of who committed them. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, seemed to represent a new era of international justice where even leaders of nations could be prosecuted for their crimes. 24 major Nazi leaders were indicted at Nuremberg, charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, the last being a new category of international law created specifically to address the Holocaust and other atrocities. The courtroom in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg became the stage for a historic reckoning. For nearly a year, prosecutors presented evidence of Nazi atrocities, films from liberated concentration camps, documents signed by the defendants ordering mass murder, testimony from survivors and perpetrators. The trial was unprecedented in human history. Never before had the victors in a war put the defeated leadership on trial for their actions, rather than simply executing them or sending them into exile. The proceedings were meant to demonstrate that the Allies fought for justice and the rule of law, not just for power. The defendants would have lawyers, would be allowed to present evidence in their defense, and would face judgment based on evidence rather than vengeance. 12 defendants were sentenced to death, 7 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life, and 3 were acquitted. Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, was sentenced to death but committed suicide by poison the night before his scheduled execution. The others sentenced to death were hanged on October 16, 1946. Their bodies were cremated and the ashes scattered in a river so their graves wouldn't become shrines for neo-Nazis. The Nuremberg trials established important precedents that following orders was not a defense for committing atrocities, that heads of state could be held accountable for crimes, and that aggressive war was itself a crime. These principles would influence international law for decades, eventually leading to the International Criminal Court. But even as Nuremberg was establishing these principles, the reality was far more complicated and far less just than the official narrative suggests. Here's what they don't tell you in textbooks. Nuremberg prosecuted only a tiny fraction of Nazi war criminals. The selection of who was prosecuted was influenced by political considerations, and within a few years, many convicted war criminals were released early because the Western Allies needed German cooperation against the Soviet Union. The trials that followed the main Nuremberg proceedings, known as the subsequent Nuremberg trials, prosecuted doctors who conducted medical experiments, judges who perverted justice in service to Nazi ideology, industrialists who used slave labor, and SS officers who ran the death camps. These trials revealed in detail how the Nazi system had corrupted every institution in German society, but they also revealed selective justice. Some major criminals escaped prosecution because they had information or expertise that the occupying powers wanted. Reinhard Gehlen, a Nazi general who ran intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, was recruited by the United States and eventually headed West German intelligence during the Cold War. Werner Braun and other scientists who had developed the V-2 rocket using slave labor from concentration camps were brought to America under Operation Paperclip and became central to the U.S. space program. Kurt Waldheim, who served in a Wehrmacht unit that committed atrocities in Yugoslavia, became UN Secretary General in 1972, his Nazi past not revealed until the 1980s.
Thousands of Nazi war criminals escaped justice entirely. Some fled to South America with help from Catholic networks and sympathetic officials. Josef Mengele, the doctor who conducted horrific experiments at Auschwitz, lived in Brazil until his death in 1979, never facing trial. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics, was captured by Israeli agents in Argentina in 1960 and tried in Israel, but thousands of others were never found or were never seriously pursued. Moreover, denazification, the process of removing Nazis from positions of power in German society, was thorough at first, but quickly abandoned. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War intensified, the Western Allies needed a functioning West German government as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Former Nazis were quietly allowed back into positions in government, business, academia, and the judiciary because their expertise was needed. By the 1950s, much of West Germany's elite consisted of people who had been active Nazis during the war, their past overlooked in the interests of Cold War politics. The Tokyo war crimes trials, which ran parallel to Nuremberg, were even more compromised by political considerations. 28 Japanese leaders were tried for war crimes, with 7 executed, including former Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. But the most significant decision was one of omission. Emperor Hirohito, who bore ultimate responsibility for Japanese aggression, and in his name all the atrocities were committed, was never charged or even called to testify. General Douglas MacArthur, who oversaw the American occupation of Japan, concluded that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize Japan and make occupation impossible. So Hirohito was protected, allowed to remain on the throne, and was even used to legitimize the occupation and the new democratic constitution that MacArthur imposed. The emperor, who had presided over a war that killed tens of millions, lived in his palace until his death in 1989, never held accountable for the crimes committed in his name. The Tokyo trials also ignored whole categories of Japanese war crimes. The comfort women system was not prosecuted, the women's suffering not considered important enough, and their testimony too embarrassing to address in public. Unit 731 and its biological warfare experiments were not prosecuted because the United States granted immunity to the perpetrators in exchange for their research data. The widespread use of forced labor received minimal attention. Many of the worst perpetrators in China escaped prosecution entirely. Moreover, the Tokyo trials were compromised by racism and victor's justice in ways that even Nuremberg wasn't. The trials focused heavily on atrocities against white prisoners of war, the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the treatment of Allied POWs, while giving less attention to the far greater atrocities committed against Asian civilians. The message was clear. Crimes against Westerners would be prosecuted vigorously, but crimes against Asians were less important.
The selective nature of justice at both Nuremberg and Tokyo established a principle that would haunt international justice ever since. The victors judge the vanquished, but no one judges the victors. Soviet judges sat at Nuremberg prosecuting Nazis for crimes against peace, while Stalin's own crimes, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the invasion of Poland, the Kielce pogrom in Poland in July 1946, where a mob killed 42 Jews who had survived the Holocaust and returned home, shocked the world and convinced many survivors that they could never return to Poland. But where could they go? Palestine was under British control, and Britain, facing Arab opposition to Jewish immigration, severely restricted how many Jews could enter. The United States maintained strict immigration quotas that prevented most refugees from entering. Other countries were similarly restrictive, so hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors remained in displaced persons camps in Germany, the country that had tried to exterminate them, because no other country would take them.
The creation of Israel in 1948 provided a destination for many Jewish refugees, but it also created a new refugee crisis. Approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes during the 1948 war, becoming refugees themselves. The Holocaust survivors found a homeland, but at the cost of creating another displaced population that remains stateless today. This is not to create moral equivalence. The Holocaust and the Palestinian refugee crisis are different in nature and scale, but to show how the war's consequences created new conflicts and new suffering. Ethnic Germans faced their own catastrophic displacement. As we discussed earlier, somewhere between 12 and 14 million Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and other Eastern European countries in the largest forced population transfer in European history. The Allies had agreed to these expulsions at Potsdam, arguing that creating ethnically homogeneous states would prevent future conflicts. The expulsions were brutal. Families were given hours to pack what they could carry and were then forced onto trains or told to walk toward Germany. Many died along the way from disease, starvation, exposure, or violence. Estimates of deaths from the expulsions range from 500,000 to over 2 million. Those who survived reached a Germany that was itself in ruins, devastated by bombing, occupied by foreign armies, with millions already homeless. The moral complexity of this situation is profound. The Germans who were expelled were being punished collectively for Nazi crimes. Most had not personally committed atrocities, and children certainly bore no responsibility. Yet the desire of Poles and Czechs to expel the German minorities from their countries was understandable given what Nazi Germany had done. The decision to allow these expulsions reflected a judgment that preventing future conflict justified immense current suffering, a calculation that prioritized abstract future peace over the concrete suffering of millions. The displaced persons crisis wasn't fully resolved until the 1950s, when economic recovery in Europe created opportunities for resettlement, when the United States and other countries finally relaxed immigration restrictions, and when the last camps were finally closed. But hundreds of thousands of people spent years in limbo, their lives suspended between a past they couldn't return to and a future that no country would offer them. Let's turn now to how victory was experienced differently in different parts of the world, because the idea of 1945 as liberation obscures a more complicated reality. For Western Europeans, French, Belgians, Dutch, Norwegians, Danes, liberation was real. The Nazis left, democratic governments were restored, and with American economic assistance through the Marshall Plan, prosperity returned remarkably quickly. By the 1950s, Western Europe was experiencing unprecedented economic growth. But for Eastern Europeans, liberation by Soviet forces meant replacing Nazi occupation with Soviet domination. Poland, for which Britain had supposedly gone to war in 1939, ended the war with millions dead, its cities destroyed, its borders moved westward, and a communist government imposed by Moscow, despite clear popular opposition. The Polish government in exile in London, which had led the resistance throughout the war, was cast aside, and its leaders forced to remain in exile or face arrest if they returned.
The same pattern repeated across Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, and the eastern part of Germany all came under communist control, either through direct Soviet occupation or through communist parties backed by Soviet power. The people of these countries had suffered terribly under Nazi occupation and had hoped that Allied victory would bring freedom. Instead, they got a different kind of dictatorship, one that would last until 1989. The division of Europe was formalized by agreements at Yalta and Potsdam, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin carved up the continent into spheres of influence. Western leaders convinced themselves this was necessary to maintain the alliance with Stalin and to ensure Soviet cooperation in establishing the United Nations and in the war against Japan. But the cost was condemning millions to decades of oppression. The division became permanent with the Berlin blockade in 1948-49, when Stalin tried to force Western powers out of Berlin by cutting off land access to the city. The Western response, a massive airlift that supplied West Berlin for nearly a year, demonstrated commitment to defending Western Europe, but also formalized the division of Germany into East and West. By 1949, two German states had been established, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, aligned with the West, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, aligned with the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain that Churchill described in his famous 1946 speech had become a physical reality. For colonized peoples who had fought for the Allies, victory brought not freedom but the attempted re-imposition of colonial rule. The British tried to retake their colonies in Asia, only to face independence movements in India, Burma, Malaya, and elsewhere. The Dutch tried to reoccupy Indonesia, facing an independence struggle that lasted until 1949. The war had fatally weakened the European colonial powers and had strengthened independence movements. Colonial soldiers who had fought for the Allies returned home unwilling to accept continued subjugation. The rhetoric of freedom and self-determination that the Allies had used to justify the war was turned against them by colonized peoples, demanding the same freedoms for which they had fought. The contradictions that had been papered over during the war, fighting for freedom while maintaining empires, could no longer be ignored. India achieved independence in 1947, though at the terrible cost of partition that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions as Hindus and Muslims fled in opposite directions between India and the newly created Pakistan. Burma, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and other British colonies in Asia gained independence in the late 1940s, but independence was often followed by violence, instability, and conflicts that continue today. The borders drawn by departing colonial powers, the ethnic and religious divisions exacerbated by colonial policies, the economic exploitation that had prevented development, all these created problems that newly independent nations struggled to overcome.
In Africa, decolonization came later and was often even more violent. The French fought a brutal war in Algeria from 1954 to 1962. The British faced the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in the 1950s. The Belgian Congo descended into chaos after independence in 1960. Portugal fought independence movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau until 1974. The process of decolonization, accelerated by World War II, would continue for decades and would create many of the conflicts that still plague the post-colonial world. For China, Japan's surrender didn't bring peace, but rather allowed the resumption of the civil war between nationalists and communists that had been partially suspended during the war against Japan. From 1945 to 1949, China was consumed by civil war that killed millions more. The communist victory in 1949 shocked the United States, which had supported the nationalists, and contributed to the paranoia about communist expansion that would drive American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. For Japan, defeat brought American occupation that lasted until 1952. MacArthur ruled Japan with almost absolute authority, imposing a new constitution that stripped the emperor of political power, gave women the right to vote, and included Article 9, which renounced war and prohibited Japan from maintaining military forces beyond those needed for self-defense. The occupation also brought land reform, democratic institutions, and economic policies that would eventually make Japan an economic powerhouse. But the occupation also protected war criminals, suppressed discussion of Japanese atrocities, and shaped Japanese memory of the war in ways that remain controversial. Many Japanese came to see themselves primarily as victims of the war, victims of the atomic bombs, of conventional bombing, of the militarists who had led them into a disastrous conflict. While there's truth to this, Japanese civilians did suffer terribly. This narrative of victimhood often obscured Japanese responsibility for the war and the atrocities committed across Asia. Germany experienced a different occupation, divided among 4 powers, American, British, French, and Soviet, that treated their zones very differently. In the Western zones, the goal became rebuilding Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan poured billions into reconstruction. By 1949, West Germany had a democratic constitution and was well on its way to economic recovery. In the East Germany, which became East Germany, the economic infrastructure was dismantled and shipped to the Soviet Union as reparations, the political system was made subservient to Moscow, and the standard of living remained low for decades. The different experiences of East and West Germany demonstrated in microcosm the different visions for post-war order that the United States and Soviet Union represented. For Germans, where they lived, a few miles one way or the other, determined whether they would experience democracy and prosperity or dictatorship and poverty. Let's talk about how rapidly the alliance that won the war transformed into the Cold War that would define global politics for the next 45 years. Even before Germany surrendered, tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were apparent. Stalin's determination to dominate Eastern Europe clashed with Western principles of self-determination. Soviet espionage against its own allies, including penetration of the Manhattan Project that gave Stalin detailed information about the atomic bomb, created mistrust. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, committed the United States to containing Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan, also in 1947, provided massive economic aid to Western Europe, partly to prevent communist parties from gaining power through economic chaos. The formation of NATO in 1949 created a military alliance to defend Western Europe against possible Soviet attack. The Soviet Union responded with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, creating opposing military alliances that would face each other across the Iron Curtain for decades. The Cold War meant that World War II's alliance of convenience became irrelevant. The Soviet Union, which had borne the brunt of defeating Nazi Germany and had lost over 20 million people doing so, became the enemy that the United States prepared to fight. Germany and Japan, recently defeated enemies whose crimes had shocked the world, became crucial allies that had to be rebuilt and rearmed. This rapid realignment shaped how the war was remembered and how justice was administered. Soviet contributions to victory were minimized in Western memory. German and Japanese war criminals were released early or had their sentences commuted because their countries were needed as allies. The moral clarity of the war, democracy versus fascism, freedom versus tyranny, gave way to the moral ambiguity of the Cold War, where the United States supported dictatorships that were anti-communist, and where the Soviet Union imposed totalitarian control on Eastern Europe in the name of security. The atomic bomb, which had ended the war against Japan, became the defining weapon of the Cold War.
The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, far sooner than Western experts had predicted, partly due to espionage and partly due to Soviet scientific talent. The arms race began, with both superpowers developing hydrogen bombs far more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. By the 1960s, both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization multiple times over. The world that emerged from World War II was in some ways more dangerous than the world that had entered it. The weapons were more destructive, capable of ending civilization rather than just killing millions. The ideological divisions were as deep as ever, just with different ideologies. The conflicts were global in scope, with the United States and Soviet Union competing for influence in every region. Let's examine how the war began to be mythologized even as it was ending, how the narratives that we've been taught were constructed in the immediate post-war years to serve political purposes. In the United States, World War II quickly became the good war, a clear moral struggle where American heroism and sacrifice defeated evil, where American power was used for noble purposes, where victory vindicated the American system. This narrative served important purposes. It unified a country that had been deeply divided about entering the war. It justified the enormous costs in lives and resources. It provided a foundation for American global leadership in the Cold War. It gave Americans a sense of moral purpose and national identity. But this narrative also simplified and sanitized the war, removing the moral ambiguities we've discussed throughout this documentary. The firebombing of cities became justified as necessary to defeat fascism. The alliance with Stalin was minimized or presented as a necessary evil that was quickly rectified. The contributions of allies, particularly the Soviets, who did most of the fighting in Europe, were downplayed to emphasize American achievement. The experiences of non-white soldiers and civilians were largely erased to maintain a narrative focused on white American and European experiences.
In Britain, the war became the nation's finest hour, the moment when Britain stood alone against Nazi tyranny and Winston Churchill's leadership saved civilization. This narrative served to obscure Britain's imperial decline, the loss of empire that was already underway, and the fact that Britain had only survived with massive American and Soviet assistance. The Bengal famine, the continuation of colonial rule, the British role in dividing Palestine and creating the conditions for ongoing conflict, these uncomfortable realities were forgotten in favor of heroic narratives about the Blitz and Dunkirk. In France, a myth of widespread resistance developed that obscured the reality of extensive collaboration. The narrative became that most French people had resisted the Nazis and that the Vichy government represented only a small minority. This wasn't true. Collaboration had been widespread, and active resistance had been limited to a small minority until late in the war. But the myth was necessary for France to rebuild national identity and move forward after the humiliation of defeat and occupation. In the Soviet Union, the war became the Great Patriotic War, a narrative of Russian heroism that minimized the contributions of non-Russian Soviet peoples, obscured Stalin's catastrophic mistakes in the war's early phases, and ignored the terror and oppression of the Soviet system. The narrative served to legitimize Soviet control of Eastern Europe and to build nationalism that the communist system otherwise struggled to generate. In Germany, a narrative developed that separated the Wehrmacht, the regular army, from the SS and the Nazi Party, portraying regular soldiers as honorable men who fought for their country rather than for Nazi ideology. This clean Wehrmacht myth was encouraged by the Western Allies, who needed to rebuild West Germany and didn't want to demonize the entire population. It wasn't true. The Wehrmacht participated extensively in war crimes and the Holocaust, but it allowed West Germans to come to terms with the past without confronting the full extent of their complicity. In Japan, as we mentioned, a narrative of victimhood developed, focusing on the atomic bombings and the suffering of Japanese civilians, while minimizing discussion of Japanese aggression and atrocities. This narrative was partly a genuine response to terrible suffering.
Japanese cities had been devastated and hundreds of thousands killed in bombing raids, but it also served to avoid confronting responsibility for the war and the crimes committed across Asia. These narratives, constructed in the years immediately after the war, shaped how subsequent generations understood what had happened. They weren't entirely false. There was British heroism during the Blitz. American soldiers did liberate concentration camps. Soviet forces did defeat the Wehrmacht at great cost, and French resistance did help liberate France. But they were incomplete, selective, and shaped by post-war political needs rather than by commitment to historical complexity.
The result is that most people's understanding of World War II comes not from the actual messy, complicated, morally ambiguous reality, but from these constructed narratives that serve national myths and political purposes. Breaking through these narratives to understand what really happened, what we've tried to do in this documentary, requires confronting uncomfortable truths that complicate the simple stories we prefer. As we near the end of this journey through the untold stories of World War II, let's reflect on what these stories reveal about history, memory, and how we understand the past. Every story we've told, from the forgotten fronts in China and Burma, to the shadow war of resistance and intelligence, to the Allied moral compromises, to the forgotten victims, to the complicated aftermath, reveals that the war was more complex, more global, more morally ambiguous, and more consequential than the simplified narratives suggest. The war didn't start in 1939 for the Chinese, who had been fighting since 1937 or earlier. It didn't end in 1945 for the displaced persons living in camps for years afterward, for the colonial subjects fighting for independence, for the victims of the Cold War conflicts that emerged from the war's end. The clear moral distinction between good and evil that justified the war was complicated by Allied actions that violated their own principles: the bombing of civilians, the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, the maintenance of colonial empires, the alliance with Stalin. The victims we remember are not necessarily those who suffered most, but those whose suffering fits narratives that serve contemporary purposes. The justice delivered at Nuremberg and Tokyo was real, but selective, punishing the defeated while ignoring the victor's crimes. The peace that followed was not peace for millions who experienced new occupations, new conflicts, and new suffering. Understanding this complexity doesn't mean abandoning moral judgment about the war. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan committed terrible crimes, and stopping them was necessary. The soldiers who fought against fascism showed real courage, and their sacrifices deserve honor. The civilians who resisted occupation, who sheltered the persecuted, who stood against evil at great personal risk, they deserve to be remembered and celebrated. But honest memory requires acknowledging all of it: the heroism and the moral compromises, the justified cause and the unjustified methods, the victims who are remembered and those who are forgotten, the liberation and the new oppressions that followed. It requires understanding that even necessary, justified wars involve terrible choices and terrible consequences. The legacy of World War II shapes our world still. The United Nations, created to prevent future world wars. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in response to the Holocaust. The concepts of war crimes and crimes against humanity that came from Nuremberg. The State of Israel, created as a homeland for Holocaust survivors. The Cold War division of the world that lasted until 1989. The decolonization process that created most of the modern nation-states in Asia and Africa. The atomic age and the existential threat of nuclear weapons. The American global dominance that emerged from the war. The collective trauma that still affects families and nations 80 years later. All of these legacies, positive and negative, trace directly to the war and its aftermath. Understanding the war in its full complexity helps us understand why the world is the way it is, why certain conflicts persist, why certain nations have power and others don't, why certain stories are told and others forgotten. It also provides lessons, though we should be cautious about drawing overly simple lessons from such a complex event. The
The lesson isn't just that appeasement fails and that evil must be confronted, though both are sometimes true. It's also that total war creates impossible moral choices, that victory is written by the powerful, that justice is often selective, that how we remember the past is shaped by present politics, and that the end of one conflict often creates the conditions for new conflicts. Perhaps the most important lesson is humility about our own certainties. The people who made the decisions we've criticized, to bomb cities, to intern Japanese Americans, to maintain empires, to ally with Stalin, to use atomic weapons, weren't necessarily evil or stupid. They faced terrible choices in extreme circumstances, with imperfect information and competing pressures. Some made choices we can recognize as wrong. Others made choices that were defensible given what they knew at the time, but that had consequences they didn't anticipate. We should remember World War II honestly, honoring the genuine heroism and sacrifice while acknowledging the moral compromises and the suffering of all victims, not just those whose stories fit comfortable narratives. We should recognize that the war was global, involving millions of people whose stories have been forgotten. We should understand that the war didn't end cleanly in 1945, but transformed into new conflicts and created problems we still face. And we should carry forward the genuine lessons that aggressive nationalism and racism can lead to catastrophic violence, that international cooperation is necessary to prevent war, that defending human rights and dignity matters, that the powerful have responsibility to act justly, and that we must always question simple narratives that make us feel good about our past while ignoring uncomfortable truths. The generation that fought World War II is nearly gone. The last veterans are in their late 90s or have passed away. The survivors of the Holocaust, of Hiroshima, of the rape of Nanjing, of the Burma Railway, they too are leaving us. Soon there will be no one alive who remembers the war firsthand. This makes honest memory more important, not less. When the last witnesses are gone, all we'll have are the stories we tell, the histories we write, the memorials we build. If those stories are incomplete or distorted, if they serve national myths rather than historical truth, if they remember some victims while forgetting others, then we dishonor all who suffered, and we deprive ourselves of the full lessons the war has to teach.
The untold stories we've explored in this documentary, the forgotten fronts, the shadow war, the moral compromises, the forgotten victims, the complicated aftermath, these deserve to be part of how we remember World War II. Not to diminish the achievements or dishonor the sacrifices, but to understand the full human reality of the most destructive conflict in history. World War II killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, roughly 3% of the world's population at the time. Every one of those people was a human being with hopes and fears, with families and dreams, who didn't want to die, but who were caught up in forces beyond their control. The soldiers who fought, the civilians who endured, the victims who suffered, the resistors who fought back, the people who made terrible choices, and the people who made heroic ones. All of them deserve to be remembered in their full humanity, not simplified into heroes and villains in a comfortable narrative. That is what this documentary has tried to do. To complicate, to contextualize, to remember the forgotten, to acknowledge the uncomfortable, and to present World War II not as a simple story of good triumphing over evil, but as a complex human tragedy that was both necessary and terrible, that saved some while destroying others, that ended one world and created another that we still navigate today. The war is over. It has been over for 80 years, but its consequences live on in the borders drawn and redrawn, in the institutions created and destroyed, in the memories passed down and suppressed, in the lessons learned and ignored, and in the world we inherited from those who fought and suffered and died in humanity's deadliest conflict. May we remember them all, the celebrated and the forgotten, the heroes and the victims, those whose stories we tell and those whose stories have been silenced, and maybe learn from their experiences to build a world where such catastrophic violence never happens again. We have completed a long journey together through the untold stories of World War II. We began before the first shot, understanding how the war was really the continuation of conflicts that started in 1918 and earlier. We traveled to forgotten fronts in China, Burma, East Africa, and across the globe where millions fought and died in theaters that Western education ignores. We entered the shadow war of codebreakers and resistance fighters whose secret contributions were crucial to victory. We confronted the uncomfortable truths about Allied actions that violated the very principles they claimed to defend. We remembered the forgotten victims, Roma, disabled people, Slavic civilians, comfort women, and millions of others whose suffering has been marginalized. And we've seen how the war's end created new conflicts and new suffering that shaped the world we live in today. These stories don't replace the history you learned in school, they complete it. They add the complexity, the global scope, the moral ambiguity, and the forgotten voices that make World War II comprehensible as the transformative human event it was, rather than as a simplified myth of good versus evil. History is not a collection of settled facts, but an ongoing conversation about what happened and what it means. Every generation rewrites history based on new questions, new evidence, and new perspectives. The untold stories we've explored are being recovered by historians who are asking different questions, listening to voices that were previously ignored, and examining evidence that was suppressed or overlooked. As you go forward, carry these stories with you. Question simple narratives. Ask whose perspectives are included and whose are missing. Recognize that almost every historical event is more complicated than it first appears. Honor all who suffered, not just those whose suffering fits comfortable stories. And understand that the past shapes the present in ways we often don't recognize unless we look closely. The war that was supposed to end all wars didn't end war, but understanding it in its full complexity, with all its tragedy and heroism, its moral clarity and moral compromise, its familiar stories and its untold stories, helps us understand ourselves, our world, and perhaps how to avoid repeating the worst of what happened. Thank you for taking this journey through the untold story behind World War II. May we never forget, not just the parts that make us feel good, but all of it, in all its terrible, complicated, heartbreaking truth.